The plane didn't just fall, it tore apart the sky. Daniel Reed had 5 seconds between the explosion and the ocean. 5 seconds to think of his daughter's face. 5 seconds to realize that every corporate hierarchy, every power structure, every carefully maintained boundary between employee and employer meant absolutely nothing when you were about to die. The Pacific swallowed them whole. When he surfaced, gasping, choking on salt water and jet fuel, the first thing he saw through the smoke and debris was her. Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Industries, the woman who'd never once looked him in the eye during 3 years of employment, clinging to a piece of fuselage, blood streaming down her face, screaming his name like he was the only person left in the world. Because he was. If you want to know how a single father and the billionaire boss who never knew his name survived what came next, stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. The water was on fire. Daniel's lungs burned as he kicked toward the surface, his body fighting against the weight of his soaked clothes and the undertow created by the sinking aircraft. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything except his own heartbeat, a frantic, desperate rhythm that screamed one word over and over: Emma, Emma, Emma. His daughter's name. His reason for everything. His head broke the surface and he sucked in air that tasted like smoke and kerosene. Around him, the ocean burned with patches of fuel ignited by the explosion, creating islands of flame that danced on the swells. Debris rained from the sky, seat cushions, luggage, pieces of metal that hissed when they hit the water. The tail section of Flight 447 was already gone, dragged under by the weight of its own destruction. "Help!" The voice cut through the chaos, high and sharp with terror. "Somebody help me!" Daniel spun in the water, his training instructor's voice from that mandatory corporate safety seminar echoing in his head. In an emergency, secure your own oxygen mask before helping others. But that voice was immediately drowned out by another one, his own father's, from 20 years ago when Daniel was just a kid learning to swim in the local pool. "You see someone drowning, son. You don't think. You move." He moved. Victoria Hale was 15 feet away, barely visible through the smoke, clutching a section of the plane's interior wall panel. Her normally perfect blonde hair was plastered to her skull, dark with water and blood. The left side of her face was covered in red, a gash above her eyebrow pumping blood down her cheek and into the collar of her once pristine white blouse. "I can't." She choked on seawater, her grip slipping on the smooth panel. "I can't feel my leg." Daniel swam toward her with powerful strokes, ignoring the pain in his right shoulder where something had struck him during the initial impact. The flames were spreading, fed by fuel still leaking from the wreckage. They had maybe 2 minutes before this entire section of ocean became an inferno. "Ms. Hale!" He grabbed the panel, stabilizing it. Up close, he could see the absolute terror in her eyes, eyes he'd only ever seen filled with cold calculation during board meetings he'd been asked to set up as part of his facility's management duties. "Ms. Hale, look at me." "My leg," she gasped. "Something hit it during the... I can't feel it. I can't..." "Listen to me." Daniel's voice cut through her panic with a firmness born from 3 years of single parenthood, of talking Emma through nightmares and school fears and the paralyzing anxiety of her first day of kindergarten without a mother. "I need you to hold on to this panel and don't let go. We have to get away from the fuel." "I can't swim. My leg." "You don't have to swim. Just hold on and kick with your good leg. I'll pull us." He didn't wait for her agreement. Daniel repositioned himself, grabbed the opposite edge of the panel, and began swimming perpendicular to the debris field. His shoulder screamed in protest with each stroke, but he pushed through it. Behind them, another explosion rocked the water as a pocket of fuel ignited, the shockwave pushing them forward like a giant hand. Victoria screamed, her fingers white-knuckled on the panel. "Keep kicking," Daniel shouted. "Don't stop." They swam, or rather, he swam while she clung to survival, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The flames fell behind them, but the smoke still choked the sky, turning the afternoon sun into a dim red eye barely visible through the haze. Daniel's arms felt like lead, his lungs burning with each breath, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. "Emma needs you. Emma needs you. Emma needs you." When his feet finally touched sand, he almost wept with relief. Ground, he gasped. Miss Hale, there's ground. We made it to... He looked up and his words died in his throat. The island rose from the water like a sleeping giant, covered in dense jungle vegetation that climbed up volcanic rock to disappear into the clouds. A beach of white sand stretched in both directions, pristine and completely untouched by human development. No buildings, no boats, no signs of civilization at all. They were alive, and they were utterly, completely alone. Daniel dragged Victoria onto the beach, her injured leg leaving a trail of blood on the white sand. She was semi-conscious now, her earlier panic giving way to shock as her body began shutting down non-essential functions. He'd seen it before. The 1,000-yard stare, the trembling that had nothing to do with cold, the shallow breathing that came from a mind trying to protect itself from trauma too big to process. "Stay with me," he said, gently lowering her onto the sand above the tide line. "Miss Hale, I need you to stay with me." "Victoria," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Victoria." It was the first time in 3 years she'd ever offered him her first name. Daniel had been a ghost in her world, the facilities guy who fixed the air conditioning and replaced light bulbs and made sure the executive washrooms were always stocked with the specific brand of hand soap she preferred. He'd set up conference rooms, coordinated maintenance schedules, and once spent 4 hours finding a replacement for a specific type of orchid that had died in her office. She'd never thanked him, never even acknowledged his existence beyond an occasional nod if they passed in the hallway. Now she was bleeding out on a beach in the middle of nowhere, and he was the only thing standing between her and death. "Okay, Victoria," he said softly. "I'm going to look at your leg now. It's going to hurt, but I need to see how bad it is." She nodded weakly, her eyes already starting to glaze over. Daniel had no medical training beyond basic first aid from his community college days and whatever he'd picked up from 7 years of single parenthood, which mostly involved treating scraped knees and checking for fevers. But he knew enough to recognize that the gash on Victoria's left thigh was deep, probably down to the muscle, and bleeding too fast. Her pale skin had already taken on a grayish tint, her lips turning blue despite the tropical heat. He needed supplies, bandages, antiseptic, something to use as a tourniquet. He needed a hospital, a doctor, a goddamn miracle. What he had was a deserted beach and debris washing up from the wreckage. "Okay," Daniel said, more to himself than to Victoria. "Okay. Think. Just think." His shirt was already soaked with seawater and blood, but he tore off the bottom half anyway, ripping it into strips with shaking hands. The gash on Victoria's leg was maybe 6 inches long, jagged edges suggesting she'd been struck by something with force during the crash. He pressed the largest piece of fabric against the wound, applying pressure while his mind raced. In the movies, they always find a first aid kit washed up on shore, or a convenient doctor among the survivors. Or... Victoria's hand suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Daniel," she said, and hearing his name in her voice, a voice he'd only ever heard barking orders at vice presidents and tearing apart quarterly reports, sent a chill down his spine. "Daniel, am I going to die?" He looked into her eyes and saw something he'd never expected to see from Victoria Hale. Vulnerability. Raw, unfiltered fear. The same fear he'd seen in Emma's eyes when she was 4 years old, and her mother had walked out the door for the last time, promising to come back and never returning. The fear of abandonment, of being left alone. "No," Daniel said firmly. "You're not going to die. I won't let you." It was a promise he had no business making, a guarantee he had no power to keep. But he said it anyway, because that's what you did when someone was terrified. You gave them hope, even if you had none yourself. He elevated her leg, used another strip of shirt to tie off the wound above the gash, and kept pressure on the bleeding. The sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. 3 hours to find fresh water, shelter, and some way to properly treat Victoria's injuries. 3 hours before darkness fell, and the island showed them what else it had been hiding. What? The first night was a lesson in helplessness. Daniel had managed to pull together a crude shelter using palm fronds and debris that had washed ashore, a twisted piece of metal that might have been part of the galley, several seat cushions that were waterlogged but still provided some padding, and a section of overhead compartment that created a partial roof. It was pathetic, barely keeping out the wind that had picked up as soon as the sun set, but it was better than nothing. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, her fever spiking as infection began to set in. Daniel had found a sealed bottle of water in a carry-on bag that had washed up on the beach, a small miracle, and used it to clean her wound as best he could before rebandaging it with strips torn from a spare shirt he'd recovered. But he could see the red streaks already beginning to spread from the gash, angry lines reaching up toward her hip. Blood poisoning, sepsis, death, if he couldn't find antibiotics or proper medical care. "Emma," Victoria whispered suddenly, making Daniel jump. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something he couldn't see. "Is that your daughter's name, Emma?" Daniel froze. In 3 years of working at Hale Industries, he'd never once mentioned his daughter to his boss, had never brought his personal life into the sterile corporate world of quarterly earnings and strategic initiatives. How did she— "I heard you," Victoria continued, her voice slurred with fever. "At the gate before we boarded. You were on the phone with her, telling her you'd be back in time for her dance recital." The memory hit Daniel like a physical blow. Standing at gate 7, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Emma's excited chatter about her ballet class, while he tried not to show how much he hated these quarterly facilities manager conferences. 2 days away from his daughter felt like 2 years. He'd promised, that he'd be home by Friday night, that he wouldn't miss her first big performance. Friday night. That was supposed to be tomorrow. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "That's my Emma. She's 7. Almost 8. "You told her you loved her," Victoria whispered. 3 times. Before you hung up." Daniel's throat tightened. "She needs to hear it. Her mom left when she was 4, just walked out. I'm all she has." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her breathing shallow and rapid. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft Daniel almost missed it. "I envy that, having someone who needs you like that. Someone who—" She coughed, a wet sound that made Daniel's chest tighten with worry. "I built an empire, a billion-dollar company, and there's no one waiting for me to come home." Before Daniel could respond, Victoria's eyes rolled back and she slumped against the seat cushion, unconscious again. Daniel sat in the darkness of their makeshift shelter, listening to the waves crash against the shore and the distant sounds of the jungle coming alive with nocturnal creatures. Somewhere out there, beyond the smoke and debris and endless ocean, Emma was waiting for him. Waiting for a father who might never come home. He'd made her a promise. And Daniel Reed didn't break promises to his daughter, which meant he couldn't let Victoria die, couldn't let himself die, couldn't give up, no matter how impossible survival seemed. "I'll get us out of this," he whispered to the darkness. "I don't know how, but I will." The island didn't answer. It just kept breathing in the night, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to the insignificant humans who'd washed up on its shore. Daniel woke to Victoria screaming. He bolted upright, his heart hammering, hands instinctively reaching for her in the pre-dawn darkness. She was thrashing in her makeshift bed, fighting against invisible demons, her injured leg twisting at an angle that made Daniel's stomach turn. "No, no, no, no! The water! I can't!" Her hands clawed at the air, eyes wide open, but seeing nothing. "Help me! Somebody help me!" "Victoria!" Daniel grabbed her shoulders, trying to keep her from hurting herself. "Victoria, you're safe. You're on the beach. You're okay. The plane's going down." She fought against his grip with surprising strength for someone half delirious with fever. "We're going down and I can't swim. I told you I can't." "You're not in the water anymore." Daniel kept his voice calm, steady, the same tone he used when Emma woke from nightmares about her mother not coming back. "You're on land. You're safe. I've got you." Something in his voice must have penetrated the fever dream because Victoria's eyes suddenly focused on his face. She stared at him for a long moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps before the fight drained out of her body and she collapsed back against the seat cushion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize." Daniel gently adjusted her position, checking the bandage on her leg. It was soaked through with blood and something else, a yellowish discharge that made his stomach turn. The infection was getting worse. "How do you feel?" like I'm burning alive from the inside out. She tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. Also like I might throw up. Is that helpful? Actually, yeah, it means you're still coherent enough to be sarcastic. Daniel found the water bottle. They were down to about a quarter left and helped her take a small sip. That's a good sign. Victoria's hand trembled as she held the bottle. In the growing dawn light, Daniel could see just how much the night had taken from her. Her skin had gone from gray to almost translucent, dark circles under her eyes, making her look like she'd aged 20 years overnight. The confident, powerful woman who'd terrorized boardrooms and demolished competitors was gone. In her place was someone fragile, human, and terrified. I need to find fresh water, Daniel said, and something to eat. Maybe some plants I can use to kit. You can't leave me here. The words came out sharper than Victoria probably intended, raw panic underneath the command. Please, don't leave me alone. Daniel understood. In her position, delirious with fever and pain, unable to walk, stranded on a beach with night creatures rustling in the jungle behind them, he wouldn't want to be alone either. I won't go far, he promised. Just up the beach a little way. I'll stay where you can see me the whole time, okay? Victoria nodded, but her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist when he started to stand. Daniel. She held his gaze, and for the first time since the crash, he saw the real person underneath the CEO mask. Thank you for pulling me out of the water, for staying. You could have, her voice cracked. You didn't have to save me. Yeah, Daniel said softly. I did. Because that's what decent people did. They helped. They showed up. They kept their promises, even when those promises were hard. He gently extracted his wrist from her grip and stood, his body protesting every movement. His shoulder had stiffened overnight, making his right arm nearly useless. His head pounded with dehydration and stress. Every muscle ached from the crash and the swim and the frantic work of building shelter. But he was alive. Victoria was alive. And they were going to stay that way. The beach revealed its treasures slowly, grudgingly. Daniel walked the tide line as the sun climbed higher, his eyes scanning the debris field that stretched for hundreds of yards in both directions. The crash site was still visible offshore, marked by a slick of fuel and floating debris. Part of him wanted to swim out there, search for supplies, maybe even find other survivors. But the rational part of his brain, the part that had kept Emma safe for 7 years on a facilities manager's salary and pure stubbornness, knew that was suicide. The currents were strong, sharks were probably already circling the wreckage, and he was in no condition to attempt a long-distance swim. So he walked the beach and took what the ocean offered. A rolling carry-on suitcase, battered but intact. Inside, men's clothes in the wrong size, a phone that was completely dead, and thank God, a toiletry kit with a small first aid pouch, Band-Aids, antiseptic wipes, and a tiny tube of antibiotic ointment that looked like it had maybe 2 uses left in it. A plastic container that had once held someone's lunch. Empty, but watertight. Could be used to collect and store water. A child's backpack with cartoon characters on it. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it, half expecting to find a small body nearby. Instead, some crayons, a coloring book, and a juice box that hadn't ruptured. He said a silent prayer that whoever owned this backpack had made it to a different piece of safety. 3 more water bottles, all sealed. A gift from the universe. A section of emergency exit row that included one of the flashlights from the safety kit. The batteries were waterlogged and useless, but the casing was intact. Maybe he could dry it out, find a way to make it work. And then, wedged between 2 rocks near the jungle's edge, he found it, a survival knife in a waterproof sheath, still attached to a piece of someone's belt. Daniel pulled it free with shaking hands, unsheathing the blade to reveal 6 inches of stainless steel that caught the morning light. This changed everything. With a knife, he could cut palm fronds properly for shelter, could potentially hunt or fish, could defend them if necessary, could maybe, just maybe, keep them alive long enough to be rescued. He looked up at the sky, scanning for planes, helicopters, any sign that rescue was coming. Nothing but clouds and seabirds and the endless empty blue. Victoria was awake when he returned, propped up on her elbows, despite the obvious pain it caused her. I thought you weren't coming back, she said. There was no accusation in her voice, just a statement of fact. I promised I wouldn't go far. Daniel set down his haul of supplies, noting the way her eyes widened at the knife, the water bottles, The first aid kit. Found some useful things. You're bleeding. Victoria nodded toward his right arm, where his shirt had torn during the night, revealing a long gash he hadn't even noticed he'd acquired. You should clean that. You first. Daniel opened the first aid kit, pulling out the precious antiseptic wipes and antibiotic ointment. This is going to hurt. Everything already hurts. But Victoria braced herself as he carefully peeled away the blood-soaked bandage from her leg. The wound looked worse in daylight, angry red, edges swollen and weeping. The smell of infection was faint but present. Daniel's hand shook as he cleaned it, using the antiseptic wipes as gently as possible while Victoria bit down on a piece of driftwood to keep from screaming. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm so sorry. I know it hurts. Just," Victoria gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Just do it. Don't stop." He worked as quickly as he could, applying the antibiotic ointment and creating a new bandage from the cleanest shirt he'd found in the suitcase. It wasn't nearly enough. The infection needed real antibiotics, professional medical care, a hospital. What it had was Daniel Reed, former college dropout turned facilities manager, doing his best with a basic first aid kit and pure desperation. "There," he said finally, tying off the bandage. "That should help." "Maybe." Victoria let the driftwood fall from her mouth, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and pain. "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" "Not even a little bit." Daniel sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I'm doing it anyway." For the first time since the crash, Victoria laughed. A short, sharp sound that was more hysteria than humor, but still somehow human. Still somehow hopeful. "We're going to die out here," she said. "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but not today." "No." He met her eyes. "Not today." The jungle was a wall of green that seemed to breathe. Daniel stood at the edge where beach met foliage, the survival knife in his hand, trying to build up the courage to step inside. He needed fresh water. Victoria's fever wouldn't break without it, and their salvaged bottles would last maybe 2 more days if they were careful. Somewhere in that tangle of vines and trees and shadows, there had to be a stream or a spring or something. He'd been standing there for 10 minutes, and he still hadn't moved. "What's wrong?" Victoria's voice drifted over from the shelter. She was too weak to walk, but she'd managed to prop herself up so she could see him. "Why aren't you going in?" "I don't know what's in there," Daniel admitted. "Could be snakes, wild pigs. I don't know what kind of animals live on Pacific Islands." "So you're just going to stand there?" "I'm strategizing." "You're panicking." Daniel turned to look at her, surprised by the bluntness. Victoria's face was still pale and fever-bright, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hint of the CEO who'd built an empire from nothing. "Yes," he said, "I'm absolutely panicking, because I have no idea what I'm doing, and if I go in there and something happens to me, you're alone on this beach and we both die. So excuse me if I need a minute to be terrified." Victoria was quiet for a moment, then, "You know what I did before my first board meeting, the one where I pitched my startup to investors who thought a 25-year-old woman couldn't possibly know anything about tech?" Daniel waited. "I locked myself in the bathroom and threw up," Victoria said. "Twice. Then I looked in the mirror and I told myself that being terrified was fine. Being unprepared was fine. Being a young woman in a room full of men who already thought I'd fail was fine, as long as I walked into that room and did it anyway. Did you get the funding? Hell no. They laughed me out of the building." Victoria smiled, sharp and fierce despite her fever. "But I walked in there, and then I walked into the next meeting, and the next, until someone finally said yes." Daniel looked at the jungle, then back at Victoria. "Are you telling me to go in there even though I'm terrified?" "I'm telling you that you're going to be terrified no matter what. Might as well be terrified while doing something useful." She paused. "Also, I'm really, really thirsty, so there's that." Despite everything, the crash, the isolation, the very real possibility they'd never be found, Daniel laughed. Actually laughed. "You're kind of a jerk when you have a fever," he said. "I'm kind of a jerk all the time," Victoria corrected. "You've just never talked to me long enough to notice." "Fair point." Daniel took a breath, tightened his grip on the knife, and stepped into the jungle. The temperature dropped immediately. the dense canopy blocking out the sun and creating a twilight world of green shadows. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation, alive with the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Every step required pushing through vines and ferns, his free hand checking the ground ahead for snakes or scorpions or God knew what else. He'd walked maybe 50 yards when he heard it, the faint sound of running water. Daniel's heart leaped. He pushed forward, following the sound, and nearly cried with relief when he broke through a wall of ferns and found a small stream cutting through the volcanic rock. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, probably fed by rainfall higher up the mountain. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, but was otherwise clean. He drank until his stomach ached, then filled every container he'd brought, the plastic lunchbox, a water bottle, even his cupped hands to splash on his face and neck. They had water, fresh drinkable water. They had a chance. Daniel had been gone for 30 minutes when Victoria heard the screaming. It started as a high-pitched shriek from somewhere deep in the jungle, followed by crashing sounds like something large moving through the undergrowth. Then Daniel's voice, shouting words she couldn't make out, and more crashing, and silence. Victoria tried to stand, her injured leg buckling immediately and sending her sprawling onto the sand. Pain exploded through her thigh, white-hot and nauseating, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was that silence stretching on, and the fact that Daniel Reed was somewhere in that jungle and she'd sent him there with her tough love speech. And what if he was hurt? What if he was dead? What if she'd just condemned the only person who'd tried to save her to... Sorry about that. Daniel emerged from the tree line, limping but alive, carrying containers of water and wearing an expression somewhere between sheepish and triumphant. Ran into a wild pig. Well, more like it ran into me. Didn't expect them to be so aggressive. Victoria realized she was crying. Not fever tears, not pain tears, but actual relief tears that she immediately tried to wipe away before he could see them. Too late. Hey! Daniel set down the water containers and hurried over, kneeling in the sand beside her. Hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? I thought... Victoria's voice cracked. I heard screaming, and I thought something had killed you, and I couldn't even stand up. I couldn't even get to you. Victoria. Daniel's hands were gentle on her shoulders. I'm okay. See? I'm right here. I'm fine. You can't die, she said, and she sounded completely unhinged even to her own ears. You have a daughter who needs you, and I don't know how to survive out here, and if you die, then I die, and I'm not going to die. Daniel's voice was firm, grounding. And neither are you. Look, I found fresh water, clean water. This changes everything. He helped her sit up properly, then opened one of the bottles and handed it to her. Victoria drank, the cool water shocking her system after hours of fever-induced dehydration. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. I'm sorry, she said when she could breathe again. I'm not usually like this. You're injured and terrified and stranded on a deserted island after surviving a plane crash, Daniel said. I think you're allowed to have a moment. I don't do moments. Victoria tried for her usual ice-cold CEO tone, but it came out shaky and small. Moments are for people who can't handle pressure. Victoria. Daniel sat back on his heels, studying her with those steady brown eyes that had probably comforted his daughter through 1,000 childhood crises. Can I tell you something? She nodded. Being strong doesn't mean never being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway. He smiled, a small quirk of his lips. A very smart person just told me that. Despite everything, Victoria felt herself smile back. They sat there on the beach as the sun climbed higher. Two people from completely different worlds, united by the simple fact that they'd survived something unsurvivable. And maybe, just maybe, they'd survive what came next too. The afternoon brought their first real conversation. Daniel had spent the morning reinforcing their shelter with fresher palm fronds and creating a better rainwater collection system using a piece of aluminum from the wreckage. Victoria watched from her position in the shade, her fever finally starting to break thanks to the fresh water and the antibiotic ointment starting to work on her infection. Can I ask you something? Daniel said as he worked. And you can tell me it's none of my business. That's usually how conversations work, Victoria said. You ask, I decide if I want to answer. Fair enough. Daniel tied off a palm frond, securing their makeshift roof. In 3 years of working at Hale Industries, you never once spoke to me directly. Not once. I know I was just the facilities guy, but why? Victoria was quiet for so long Daniel thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, because speaking to you would have made you real. Daniel stopped working, turning to look at her. The company was everything, Victoria continued, her voice careful, measured. Every decision, every interaction, every minute of every day was about building something bigger. And if I let myself see the people, really see them, acknowledge them as humans with families and lives and problems, then every layoff would hurt. Every budget cut would be personal. Every hard choice would be impossible. So you just didn't see us, Daniel said slowly. I saw numbers, efficiency metrics, cost-benefit analyses. Victoria looked away toward the ocean. I saw what I needed to see to make the company successful. And it worked. We grew. We thrived. We became one of the most profitable firms in the industry. And you were alone, Daniel said quietly. And I was alone, Victoria agreed. Daniel went back to working on the shelter, processing this. He'd always assumed his invisibility in the corporate world was because he was a nobody, just another employee, easily replaced, not worth noticing. It had never occurred to him that Victoria's blindness might have been intentional, a survival mechanism of its own kind. For what it's worth, he said after a while, I get it. Single parents do the same thing sometimes. You can't think about every missed soccer game or school event or moment you should have been there for, or you'll break down. You just focus on the next task, the next bill, the next day. Is that what you do? Used to. Daniel secured another section of roofing. But then Emma started asking why I looked sad in all her school photos. She was 6 years old, and she noticed that I was just going through the motions. So I decided to stop surviving and start actually living. How? Victoria's question was genuine, curious. How do you do both? How do you work and provide and still be present? Honestly, I don't know if I've figured it out yet. Daniel climbed down from the shelter frame, wiping sweat from his forehead. But I try. I say yes to the moments that matter. I say no to extra shifts when there's a recital or a parent-teacher conference. I prioritize differently than I did before. And the company just accepts that? Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. The company doesn't notice. I'm the facilities guy, remember? As long as the lights stay on and the toilets flush, nobody cares about my schedule. Victoria winced. I'm sorry. For what? For not noticing, for not seeing you, for building a company culture where people like you could work for years and still be invisible. She met his eyes. You saved my life, Daniel. And until 3 days ago, I didn't even know your name. You knew my name, Daniel said. It's on my badge, my emails, my work orders. I knew the name. I didn't know the person. Victoria shifted position, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured leg. There's a difference. Daniel didn't argue because she was right, and maybe, in the same way, he hadn't really known her either. He'd known Victoria Hale, the CEO, the icy, untouchable executive who commanded million-dollar deals and destroyed competitors without mercy. But he hadn't known Victoria the person, the woman who panicked when left alone, who threw up before important meetings, who'd built walls so high around herself that she'd ended up completely isolated even while surrounded by thousands of employees. Well, Daniel said, offering her a small smile, I guess we're getting to know each other now. Stranded on a deserted island, Victoria said, this is definitely not how I imagined team-building exercises would go. Daniel laughed, actually laughed, and was surprised when Victoria joined in. It was absurd, all of it. The situation, their circumstances, the fact that they were joking while stranded in the middle of nowhere with diminishing chances of rescue. But maybe that absurdity was the only thing keeping them sane. Night fell like a curtain. Daniel had managed to start a small fire using dried coconut husks and the spark from his waterproof lighter that had survived in his pocket. Another small miracle. The flames pushed back the darkness and provided some small comfort against the sounds of the jungle coming alive around them. Victoria's fever had broken properly now, leaving her exhausted but clearer-minded than she'd been since the crash. She sat propped against a seat cushion, wrapped in an airplane blanket Daniel had found, staring into the flames. "Tell me about Emma," she said suddenly. Daniel looked up from where he was attempting to sharpen a piece of bamboo into a fishing spear. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What she's like, what makes her laugh, how you became a single dad." Victoria paused. "If you want to talk about it, that is." Daniel was quiet for a moment, the memories flooding back. Then he started talking. He told her about meeting Emma's mother in college, about the unexpected pregnancy that had derailed both their plans for the future, about trying to make it work despite being too young and too broke and too unprepared for parenthood, about coming home one day to find Emma crying in her crib and a note on the kitchen counter saying her mother couldn't do it anymore, couldn't handle the responsibility, couldn't sacrifice her life for a child she'd never really wanted. "She was 4 years old," Daniel said, his voice rough with old pain. "Emma was 4, and her mom just walked away, left me with a kid, a part-time job, and about $300 in the bank." "What did you do?" "What could I do? I figured it out." Daniel kept working on the spear, the repetitive motion soothing. Dropped out of school, got the facilities job at Hale Industries because it had benefits and steady hours. Learned to do Emma's hair from YouTube videos. Became an expert on princess movies and playground politics. That must have been terrifying. "It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done," Daniel admitted. "Until this." Victoria was quiet, processing. Then, "She's lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have her." Daniel set down the spear, looking across the fire at his boss. Former boss? Current survival partner? Seeing her in the flickering light. "She's the reason I get up every morning. The reason I work hard even when the work is invisible. The reason I can't give up out here." "Because you made her a promise." "Because I always keep my promises to Emma. Always." Victoria stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft Daniel almost missed it. "My father promised me a lot of things. That he'd stop drinking, that he'd show up to my school events, that he'd be proud of me." She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself. "He broke every single one. So I promised myself I'd never need anyone's promises again. I'd be so successful, so powerful, so completely self-sufficient that I'd never be disappointed." "Did it work?" Daniel asked gently. "I built a billion-dollar company. I became one of the most powerful women in tech. I achieved everything I set out to achieve." Victoria met his eyes across the fire. "And I ended up exactly where I feared most, alone, needing someone, and having to trust that they won't let me down." The weight of that trust settled between them, heavy and sacred. Daniel felt it in his chest, the responsibility of being the person Victoria Hale was relying on to keep her alive, to keep his promise that she wouldn't die out here. "I won't let you down," he said. "How can you know that?" "Because I don't break promises." Daniel picked up the spear again, testing the point. "Not to Emma, and not to you." Victoria didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted, a subtle relaxation, like a wall beginning to crack. They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers while the island breathed around them. Somewhere in the darkness, something screamed. Whether animal or bird, Daniel couldn't tell. But for the first time since washing up on this beach, the sounds didn't terrify him quite as much. They were still alive, still fighting, and tomorrow they'd wake up and fight again. Because that's what survivors did. They kept going, even when going seemed impossible. They kept promises, even when promises seemed foolish. They kept each other alive because the alternative was dying alone. And Daniel Reed had learned a long time ago that he was very, very good at refusing to quit, even when quitting would have been easier. Especially then. The signal fire was Victoria's idea. Day 4 dawned with clear skies, the first since the crash, and Victoria had insisted, despite her weakened state, that they needed to create a visible rescue signal. Daniel had spent the morning gathering dried wood and palm fronds, building a massive pile on the highest point of beach they could access without Victoria having to move too far. "If a plane flies over, they'll see the smoke," Victoria explained, her strategic mind kicking in even while fever weak. Commercial flights from Asia to South America pass over this region. We just need to be visible. And if no planes come? Then we build it bigger tomorrow. Daniel had to admire her refusal to accept defeat. Even half delirious with infection, Victoria Hale was still thinking 3 steps ahead, still planning for success. They lit the signal fire at midday when the sun was highest, and the smoke would be most visible against the sky. Daniel used their precious lighter fluid sparingly, saving most of it for the cooking fire in emergency situations. The pile caught quickly, dried palm fronds crackling and sending up a thick column of white smoke that rose straight up in the calm air. "There," Victoria said with satisfaction, leaning heavily on the walking stick Daniel had carved for her. "Now we wait." They waited. Hours passed. The signal fire burned down and Daniel added more fuel, keeping the smoke going. They scanned the sky until their eyes ached, looking for any sign of aircraft, helicopters, rescue vessels. Nothing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Daniel felt Victoria's shoulders slump beside him. "They're not coming," she said quietly. "Are they?" "Not today," Daniel agreed, "but tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll light another fire and wait again." Victoria's voice was flat, defeated. "And the day after that, and the day after that, until we run out of fuel or hope, or both." Daniel wanted to argue, to offer false comfort, to tell her rescue was definitely coming. But he'd never been good at lying, especially to people who mattered. "Maybe," he said instead. "Or maybe tomorrow's the day someone sees us. We don't know. We can't know." "How do you stay so positive?" Victoria turned to look at him, genuine confusion in her eyes. "How do you keep hoping when everything is objectively terrible?" Daniel thought about Emma, about single parenthood and broken promises and learning to make a life out of scattered pieces, about the 1,000 small choices he'd made over 7 years to keep moving forward, even when forward seemed impossible. "I don't know if it's hope," he said slowly. "Maybe it's just stubbornness. Maybe I'm just too stupid to know when to quit." Victoria laughed, sharp and sudden. "You're not stupid, Daniel." "Then maybe I just don't have a choice." He met her eyes. "Because the alternative is lying down and dying, and I can't do that. I won't do that. Not when Emma's waiting for me." "And me?" Victoria's question was quiet, vulnerable. "What if I want to quit? What if I'm tired of fighting?" Daniel turned to face her fully, this woman who'd built an empire on sheer willpower and was now coming apart at the seams because willpower couldn't fight infection or isolation or the crushing weight of helplessness. "Then I'll carry you," he said simply, "until you can fight again." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, the first he'd seen her cry since the crash. Not pain tears or fever tears, but something deeper, something that came from a place that had been locked away for so long she'd probably forgotten it existed. "No one's ever," her voice broke, "no one's ever offered to carry me before." "Then they didn't deserve you," Daniel said, and he meant it. That night, Victoria told him about the empire. They sat by the cooking fire, smaller than the signal fire, carefully maintained to conserve fuel, while Daniel attempted to cook some of the fish he'd managed to spear earlier. The flesh was charring more than cooking, his survival skills clearly not including wilderness cuisine, but it was protein and they needed it. "I was 23 when I started the company," Victoria said, accepting a piece of questionably cooked fish with only a small grimace. "Fresh out of Stanford with a computer science degree and an idea for cloud-based collaboration software." "That's how Hale Industries started?" Daniel asked. "Collaboration software?" "Started and ended there. Everything else we acquired or developed came back to that core principle: connecting people, making communication seamless, breaking down barriers between teams." Victoria picked at the fish, not really eating. "The irony isn't lost on me that I built a company designed to bring people together while isolating myself completely." "Why did you?" "Why did I what?" "Isolate yourself." Daniel set down his own portion, giving her his full attention. "You clearly understand the value of human connection. You built a whole company around it, so why shut yourself off?" Victoria was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father drank himself to death when I was 19. Liver failure, completely preventable, absolutely his own choice. She wrapped her arms around herself despite the tropical heat. I was in my sophomore year at Stanford. He called me drunk at 2 in the morning, told me he was proud of me. First time he'd ever said it. Last time, too. He was dead 3 weeks later. I'm sorry, Daniel said, meaning it. I flew home for the funeral. Stood in a church full of people who'd enabled his drinking, listened to them talk about what a great guy he was, what a tragedy it was. Victoria's voice hardened, and I decided right then that I'd never let anyone have that kind of power over me. Never let myself need someone so much that losing them could destroy me. So you built walls. I built an empire. Victoria looked at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. Same thing, really. Both keep people at a distance. Both protect you from getting hurt. Daniel understood. He'd built his own walls after Emma's mother left. Smaller, different, but walls nonetheless. The decision to keep his personal life completely separate from work. The refusal to date or even consider a relationship because it meant potential vulnerability, potential abandonment, potential pain for Emma if it didn't work out. Safety through isolation. Protection through emotional distance. It was a survival strategy he recognized intimately. You know what Emma asked me last month? Daniel said softly. She asked me if I was lonely. What did you tell her? I lied. I told her I was fine. Daniel poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks drift up into the night. But the truth is, I'm so lonely sometimes it physically hurts. I have exactly one friend, my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who watches Emma when I work late. I haven't been on a date in 7 years. I spend my days fixing things for people who don't see me, and my nights helping with homework and making dinner and being a parent, which is wonderful but also completely exhausting. So why do it? Victoria asked. Why not? I don't know. Try, date, make friends, let people in? Because letting people in means they can leave, Daniel said simply. And I can't do that to Emma again. Can't risk bringing someone into our lives who might walk away and break her heart. So I stay lonely, stay isolated, stay safe. That's not living, Daniel. That's just surviving, says the woman who built an empire specifically to avoid human connection. Victoria flinched, but there was no anger in it, just recognition. We're a mess, aren't we? She said finally. Completely, Daniel agreed. But we're alive, and we're here, and maybe... He hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe being stranded together is forcing us to do the thing we're both terrible at. What's that? Letting someone in, trusting someone, being vulnerable. Daniel met her eyes across the fire. I've told you more in 4 days than I've told anyone in years, and I think you've done the same. Victoria didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between fear and hope, vulnerability and strength. What if we die out here, Daniel? What if all this honesty and vulnerability and connection doesn't matter because no one ever finds us? Then at least we didn't die alone, Daniel said. At least we died as people who saw each other, really saw each other. Not boss and employee, not CEO and facilities guy, but two humans who survived something impossible together. That's surprisingly profound for someone who burns fish. Hey, I'm getting better. Daniel picked up the charred remains of his dinner. This one's only mostly inedible. Victoria laughed, and the sound echoed across the beach, mixing with the waves and the crackling fire and the endless night sounds of the jungle. They were stranded, they were injured, they were running out of supplies and time and hope, but they weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The morning of day 5 brought rain. It started as a whisper against the palm fronds of their shelter, then built into a steady drumming that woke Daniel from a restless sleep filled with dreams of Emma's dance recital. In the dream, he'd been sitting in the audience watching his daughter spin across the stage, but every time he tried to call out to her, no sound came from his throat. She kept dancing, never knowing he was there, never hearing him say he was proud of her. He woke with tears on his face and Victoria's hand on his shoulder. You were talking in your sleep, she said quietly. Calling for Emma. Daniel wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught so vulnerable. But Victoria's expression held no judgment, only understanding. She'd had her own nightmares during the night. He'd heard her crying out, Something about drowning, about water filling her lungs. "What day is it?" he asked, though he already knew. He'd been counting, scratching marks into a piece of driftwood like some cliché castaway from a movie. "Friday," Victoria said. "The recital was last night." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. While he'd been stranded on this beach, fighting to keep them alive, his daughter had performed her first big ballet number without him there, had scanned the audience looking for his face and not found it, had probably cried when Mrs. Chen tried to explain that Daddy's plane had some trouble, but he'd be home soon. Except the news had probably reached San Francisco by now. Flight 447, missing over the Pacific. All passengers presumed lost. They'd be planning memorials, filing death certificates, moving on. Emma would grow up thinking her father had broken his promise. "Daniel," Victoria's voice was firm, cutting through his spiral. "Don't do that. Don't go to that dark place." "I missed it," he said, his voice breaking. "I promised her I wouldn't miss it, and You survived a plane crash. You saved my life. You've kept us alive for 5 days on a deserted island with nothing but determination and a pocket knife." Victoria grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. "Emma will understand. When you get back to her, and you will get back to her, she'll understand." "How do you know?" "Because she's your daughter, and if she's anything like you, she'll just be grateful you're alive." The rain intensified, turning the beach into a sheet of gray. Daniel could barely see the ocean through the downpour. He should have been grateful. Their water collection system was filling rapidly, giving them fresh drinking water without the risky jungle trek. But all he could think about was Emma, alone, believing he'd abandoned her like her mother had. "Tell me about the recital," Victoria said, settling back against the shelter wall. "What was she going to perform?" "Swan Lake, like a simplified version for her age group, but still." Daniel found himself smiling despite the pain. "She'd been practicing for 3 months. Every night after dinner, she'd make me watch her routine. I must have seen it 100 times. Show me." Daniel looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "What?" "Show me the routine." "You've seen it 100 times, you said. So, show me." Victoria's eyes held a challenge. "Or are you too cool to dance in the rain?" "I'm a 34-year-old facilities manager with an injured shoulder, stranded on a beach. Cool left the building about 5 days ago." "Then dance." It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was possibly the stupidest thing he could do while trying to survive on a deserted island. Daniel stood up and started moving through Emma's ballet routine. He didn't have her grace or precision. His version was clumsy, hampered by injuries and exhaustion, and the fact that he was doing a 7-year-old's ballet choreography in the pouring rain while his boss watched. But he moved through the steps he'd memorized from watching Emma practice. The opening pose, the series of small jumps she'd struggled with for weeks, the spin that always made her dizzy, the final curtsy that she'd perfected just last week. When he finished, breathing hard and soaked through, Victoria was crying. "That was beautiful," she said. That was embarrassing." "No." Victoria shook her head firmly. "That was love. That was a father who cares so much about his daughter that he memorized her routine even though he never expected to perform it himself. That's what Emma will remember, Daniel. Not that you missed one recital, but that you cared enough to learn every step." Daniel sank back down beside her, suddenly exhausted. The rain continued its assault on their shelter, but inside their small protected space, something had shifted. The performance had been cathartic, releasing some of the guilt and pain he'd been carrying. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making me dance in the rain like an idiot." Victoria smiled, and it transformed her face. In 5 days, Daniel had seen her terrified, fevered, vulnerable, and fierce, but this was the first time he'd seen her genuinely happy. "You know what I realized watching you?" she said. "I've never loved anything the way you love Emma. I've been passionate about success, obsessed with building the company, driven to prove everyone wrong. But I've never loved something so much that I'd memorize ballet choreography just to feel closer to it." "It's different with kids," Daniel said. "They change everything. Suddenly you're capable of love you didn't know existed, and fear you didn't know was possible." "Do you think—" Victoria hesitated, then pushed forward. "Do you think it's too late for me to have that kind of connection with someone?" Daniel looked at this woman who'd spent her adult life building walls, isolating herself, choosing power over connection, who was now stranded on a beach asking if redemption was possible. "No," he said firmly. "It's never too late. You just have to choose differently." "How?" "You start small. You let one person in, then another. You take risks even when they terrify you. You accept that sometimes people will let you down, but sometimes they won't, and the second group makes the first group worth it." Victoria absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "Is that what you did? After Emma's mother left?" "No," Daniel admitted. "I did the opposite. I shut everyone out except Emma. Built my whole life around keeping her safe and isolated from anyone who might hurt her." He paused. "But I'm starting to think maybe I got it wrong. Maybe by protecting her from potential pain, I'm also keeping her from potential joy." "What changed your mind?" Daniel gestured at their shelter, the beach, the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. "This, you, realizing that isolation doesn't actually protect you. It just makes you alone when things go wrong." The rain began to ease, tapering off to a light mist. Through the clouds, Daniel could see hints of blue sky trying to break through. The storm was passing. They'd survived another night, another challenge. "When we get rescued," Victoria started. "If we get rescued," Daniel corrected gently. "When?" Victoria insisted with surprising fierceness. "When we get rescued, I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to actually see the people who work for me, learn their names, ask about their families, build a company that values humans, not just productivity." "That's a good plan." "And you're going to stop hiding," Victoria continued, pointing at him. "You're going to let people into your life. Date. Make friends. Give Emma a chance to see what healthy relationships look like, instead of watching her father slowly disappear into loneliness." "Deal," Daniel said, "but only if we both actually follow through." "Deal." They shook on it, their hands clasping firmly despite the absurdity of making life-changing promises while stranded on a deserted island. But maybe that was exactly when such promises mattered most, when everything else had been stripped away, and all that remained was honest acknowledgement of the things they'd gotten wrong. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the beach in golden light. Daniel stood and walked to the edge of their shelter, scanning the horizon out of habit more than hope, and froze. "Victoria," he said, his voice strange and tight. "Victoria, there's a ship." She struggled to stand, grabbing her walking stick and limping over to where he stood. Together they stared at the tiny dot on the horizon, barely visible against the glare of sunlight on water. "Are you sure?" Victoria whispered, afraid to hope. "I'm sure." Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. "We need to signal them, now." They moved as fast as Victoria's injured leg would allow, Daniel helping her across the beach to where their signal fire waited. His hand shook as he grabbed the lighter, praying it would still work after the rain. Once, twice, 3 times he tried before the spark caught and the dried palm fronds began to smoke. "More fuel," Victoria urged, pointing to their carefully gathered pile. "Make it bigger." Daniel threw everything they had onto the fire. Palm fronds, pieces of airplane seats, anything that would burn and create thick black smoke. The column rose into the clear post-storm sky, a pillar of desperate hope reaching toward the heavens. The ship didn't change course. "Come on," Daniel muttered, watching the distant vessel. "Come on, look this way. Please." They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, watching the ship maintain its steady path across the horizon. The smoke billowed up, impossible to miss, but the ship just kept going. "They're not stopping," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "They don't see us." "They have to see us. That smoke is—" Daniel's voice cracked. "They have to." But the ship continued on its course, growing smaller against the horizon. Within 30 minutes, it had disappeared completely, leaving nothing but empty ocean and the crushing weight of hope deferred. Daniel sank to his knees in the sand, still staring at the spot where the ship had been. They'd been so close, so impossibly close to rescue, to going home, to seeing Emma again, and the ship had sailed right past them like they didn't exist. "Daniel!" Victoria's hand was on his shoulder, her own voice thick with tears. "Daniel, we'll try again. The next ship that comes by—" "What if there isn't a next ship?" The words burst out of him, raw and broken. What if that was our only chance and we missed it? What if we die out here and Emma grows up thinking I chose to leave her? You didn't choose anything, Victoria said firmly, lowering herself to the sand beside him despite the obvious pain it caused her leg. This isn't your fault. The crash wasn't your fault. Missing the recital wasn't your fault. And if that ship didn't see us, that's not your fault either. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. Emma's still going to grow up without a father. No. Victoria grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her the same way she'd done that morning. You don't get to give up. You promised me you wouldn't, remember? You said you'd carry me until I could fight again. Well, now I'm carrying you, and I'm telling you, we're not done. Not yet. Daniel looked into her eyes and saw reflected there the same desperate determination he'd seen in his own mirror every morning for the past 7 years. The refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. The stubborn insistence on hope even when hope was foolish. Okay, he whispered. Okay. They sat together on the beach, watching their signal fire burn down to nothing, and made a silent pact to keep fighting. Because what else could they do? Giving up meant dying, and they weren't ready for that. Not yet. The afternoon brought a gift wrapped in tragedy. Daniel was walking the beach, checking the tide line for useful debris, when he found the life raft. It was half inflated, torn along one side, clearly damaged during the crash. But inside, strapped to the emergency supply compartment, was a waterproof survival kit. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside, emergency flares, a signal mirror, a basic medical kit with actual antibiotics, water purification tablets, emergency rations, a real compass, and a solar-powered emergency beacon. Victoria! Daniel's shout echoed across the beach. Victoria, you need to see this! She made her way over as quickly as her injured leg allowed, her eyes widening when she saw the contents of the survival kit spread across the sand. Is that antibiotics? Real ones. Daniel held up the sealed package like it was made of gold. And flares and a beacon and... Victoria, this changes everything. For the first time since the ship had disappeared, hope flickered back to life in Victoria's eyes. The beacon. Can you activate it? Daniel examined the device carefully. It was designed to send out a distress signal that would be picked up by satellites and relay their position to rescue services. But the solar panel was cracked, probably damaged during the crash, and he had no way of knowing if it still worked. I can try, he said. But even if it works, it might take days or even weeks for someone to respond. We're pretty far off standard shipping lanes. But they'll know we're here. They'll know to look for us. Yeah. Daniel activated the beacon, watching a small red light begin to blink. They'll know. The antibiotics were the more immediate miracle. Daniel helped Victoria take the first dose that evening, watching the fever that had been threatening to return finally break for good. Within 2 days, the infection in her leg had visibly improved, the angry red streaks fading and the wound beginning to close properly. I can't believe we had antibiotics this whole time, Victoria said on day 7, examining her healing leg with wonder. Just floating out there in that raft. We didn't know to look for it, Daniel pointed out. And honestly, you needed that infection to get bad enough that we'd appreciate these when we found them. That's a very optimistic take on me almost dying from sepsis. I'm an optimist. It's annoying, I know. Victoria smiled, and Daniel noticed how different she looked now compared to that first day. The terror had faded from her eyes, replaced by something calmer, more grounded. She'd stopped flinching at every jungle sound and had even started helping with camp tasks, insisting on using her hands even when her leg kept her stationary. Can I tell you something? She said, breaking the comfortable silence. Always. This is the longest I've gone without checking my phone or email since I was 23 years old. Victoria looked almost embarrassed by the admission. I used to sleep with my phone next to my pillow. Would wake up at 3 a.m. to answer messages from our Asian offices. Couldn't even eat breakfast without scrolling through reports. Sounds exhausting. It was, but it was also safe. As long as I was working, I was in control. I was productive. I was valuable. She paused. Out here, none of that matters. I can't send emails or attend meetings or close deals. I'm just me, without all the armor. And how does that feel? Victoria considered the question seriously. Terrifying, but also kind of freeing? Like maybe I don't have to be Victoria Hale, CEO, every single second. Maybe I can just be Victoria. For what it's worth, Daniel said, I prefer Victoria to Ms. Hale. You never called me Ms. Hale before the crash. Sure I did, every time I had to send you a work order or schedule maintenance in your office. But you never spoke to me directly. Because you never spoke to me, Daniel pointed out gently. Hard to build a relationship with someone who doesn't acknowledge your existence. Victoria winced. I really was terrible, wasn't I? You were efficient, focused, very good at your job. Daniel poked at the cooking fire with a stick. But, yeah, also kind of terrible to the people who worked for you. I want to fix that. When we get back. She looked at him seriously. I mean it, Daniel. I want to build something different, a company that actually values its people. That's going to be hard. Shareholders care about profits, not employee satisfaction. Then I'll find shareholders who care about both, or go private, or, I don't know, I'll figure it out. Victoria's voice took on the steel Daniel recognized from her CEO persona. But I'm not going back to the way things were. This island taught me too much. What did it teach you? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the ocean in a spectacular display of orange and purple. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. It taught me that power is an illusion, that money can't buy survival, that the person I treated as invisible was the one who saved my life when everything else fell apart. She turned to look at him. It taught me that I've been living wrong, Daniel. Building the wrong things, chasing the wrong goals, hurting the wrong people in pursuit of success that left me completely alone. You weren't alone. You had employees, board members, investors. I had people who wanted things from me. That's not the same as having people who care about you. Victoria wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears that kept appearing. You know what the saddest part is? When that plane was going down, I realized there wasn't a single person on earth who would truly mourn me. My company would replace me within a week. The board would issue a statement. Stock might dip temporarily, but no one would cry the way Emma will cry if you don't make it home. Daniel's chest tightened at the thought of his daughter grieving, but he pushed past it to focus on Victoria's pain. That's not true, he said. I'd mourn you. Victoria laughed bitterly. You've known me for a week, and most of that week I've been either unconscious or complaining. I've known you for 3 years, Daniel corrected. I just didn't know I was allowed to see you as human until now. But I see you, Victoria. And if something happened to you, I'd mourn. Not the CEO. You. The person who throws up before big meetings but does them anyway. Who built an empire from nothing. Who's scared of being alone but too proud to admit it. Who dances in the rain when I need her to, even though her leg is injured and it must hurt like hell. I didn't dance. You danced. You made me dance. Which is basically the same thing. Victoria smiled despite her tears. You're very annoying when you're being kind. It's one of my best qualities. They lapsed into silence, but it was comfortable now, easy. The kind of silence you could only share with someone who'd seen you at your absolute worst and decided you were worth keeping around anyway. Day 8 brought another storm, this one more violent than the first. The wind tore at their shelter, ripping away palm fronds and threatening to collapse the whole structure. Rain came down in sheets so thick Daniel couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Thunder cracked overhead like the sky was splitting open, and lightning turned the beach into a strobe-lit nightmare. We need to move, Daniel shouted over the wind. This shelter won't hold. Move where? Victoria shouted back, clutching her walking stick as another gust nearly knocked her over. Daniel looked around frantically, searching for options. The jungle was too dangerous in a storm. Falling branches, flooding, God knew what else. But staying on the exposed beach meant risking the full force of the storm. Then he saw it, a small outcropping of volcanic rock about 50 yards up the beach, creating a natural overhang that might provide some protection. There! He pointed, already moving to help Victoria. Can you make it? Do I have a choice? They struggled across the beach, fighting against wind that tried to push them backward with every step. Victoria's injured leg nearly gave out twice, but Daniel caught her both times, his arm around her waist supporting most of her weight. Rain lashed their faces, Lightning illuminated their desperate journey in brief flashes of white light. They made it to the rock outcropping just as a particularly violent gust tore their shelter completely apart, sending debris flying across the beach. Daniel pulled Victoria under the overhang, both of them collapsing against the stone wall, gasping and shaking. "Are you okay?" he asked, checking her over for injuries. "Define okay," Victoria managed between breaths. "My leg is screaming, I'm soaked through, and I'm pretty sure I just watched our entire camp blow away. But I'm alive, so there's that." Daniel couldn't help it. He laughed. The situation was so absurd, so completely terrible, that laughter was the only appropriate response. Victoria joined in, and soon they were both laughing like maniacs while the storm raged around them. "We're going to die out here," Victoria said when the laughter finally subsided. "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but not today." "No, not today." The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning. By the time it finally passed, their camp was destroyed. The shelter was gone, scattered across the beach in pieces. Their carefully gathered supplies were either blown away or soaked through. Even their signal fire had been reduced to wet ash, but the survival kit had survived, tucked safely in its waterproof container under the rock outcropping. And the emergency beacon was still blinking its steady red pulse, sending out its silent call for help across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. "We rebuild," Daniel said, surveying the destruction with exhausted determination. "That's what we do. We rebuild and we keep going." Victoria nodded, leaning on her walking stick and looking at the beach with the same analytical mind she'd once used to evaluate quarterly reports. "We'll need a better shelter design," she said, "something that can withstand high winds. And we should move our camp to higher ground, away from potential storm surges." "Look at you, thinking like a survivor." "I learned from the best." Victoria met his eyes, and there was warmth there that hadn't existed a week ago. Respect. Maybe even friendship. "Come on, boss, let's get to work." "I'm not your boss," Daniel pointed out. "No," Victoria agreed with a small smile, "but you're definitely in charge out here. So that makes you the boss of me. How's it feel?" "Weird," Daniel admitted. "Really weird." They spent day 9 rebuilding what the storm had destroyed, working together with the easy rhythm of a team that had learned each other's strengths. Victoria's strategic mind planned the new shelter design, while Daniel's practical skills brought her vision to life. By sunset, they had a smaller but sturdier structure positioned in a more protected spot near the rock outcropping. That night, as they sat by their rebuilt fire eating roasted fish that Daniel was getting marginally better at cooking, Victoria asked the question he'd been dreading. What if the beacon doesn't work? What if no one's coming? Daniel had thought about this constantly over the past 2 days. The beacon's damaged solar panel, the remoteness of their location, the possibility that they'd already been declared dead and the search had been called off. "Then we survive anyway," he said finally. "We figure out how to make this island our home. We find ways to stay healthy, stay fed, stay sane, and we wait for the next ship or the next storm that might blow us somewhere else, or..." He shrugged. "Or we grow old on this beach telling each other stories until one of us dies and the other has to figure out how to keep going alone." That's the most depressing pep talk I've ever heard. You asked for honesty, not optimism. Victoria was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised him. "If we do have to stay here permanently, at least I won't be alone. That's something." "Yeah," Daniel agreed softly. "That's something." The next morning, day 10, started like all the others. Daniel woke before dawn, checked the beacon to make sure it was still working, scanned the horizon for ships or planes. Victoria woke shortly after, her healing leg allowing her more mobility each day. They had breakfast, some of the emergency rations mixed with coconut meat, and discussed their plans for the day. Daniel was midway through explaining his idea for building a better fishing trap when Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm. "Daniel, listen!" He stopped talking, straining his ears. At first, he heard nothing but the usual sounds: waves, birds, wind through palm fronds. Then he heard it, the distant thrum of an engine. They both scrambled to their feet, Daniel helping Victoria stand despite her haste. The sound was growing louder, definitely mechanical, definitely human-made. "Is that..." Victoria's voice was breathless with hope and fear. "A boat," Daniel confirmed, his heart hammering. That's definitely a boat. They rushed to the beach, Victoria moving faster than she had since the crash, despite the pain it must have caused her injured leg. The sound was coming from the north, around the curve of the island where they couldn't see yet. The flares! Daniel ran back to their shelter, grabbing the emergency flares from the survival kit. His hands shook as he tried to remember the instructions. Pull the cap, strike the base, aim away from yourself. The boat appeared around the headland, a small Coast Guard cutter, white and orange, flying the flag of American Samoa. On its deck, figures moved with purpose, scanning the coastline. Daniel pulled the cap off the first flare, struck it against the base, and aimed it toward the sky. It shot upward with a whoosh and a brilliant red light that burned against the morning blue. Someone on the boat shouted. The vessel changed course, heading directly toward them. "They see us," Victoria whispered, and Daniel looked over to see tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, they see us. They're coming." He pulled her into a hug, both of them shaking with relief and disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. After 10 days of survival, of fighting and hoping and refusing to give up, rescue had finally come. The boat approached carefully, mindful of the reef, and dropped anchor about 100 yards offshore. A smaller inflatable was lowered, and 2 Coast Guard officers motored toward the beach. As they drew closer, Daniel could see the shock on their faces. Probably not what they'd expected to find after tracking an emergency beacon for 3 days. "Daniel Reed?" one of them called out as they reached the shallows. "Victoria Hale?" "Yes!" Daniel shouted back, his voice cracking. "We're survivors from Flight 447. "Oh, thank God," the officer said, and there were tears in his eyes, too. "Thank God. Everyone thought the search was called off 4 days ago. Everyone on that flight was presumed dead." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Emma thought he was dead, had been mourning him for almost a week, had probably already attended some kind of memorial service, listening to people say nice things about a father who'd broken his promise. "My daughter," Daniel said urgently as the officers reached them, already checking them over for injuries. "I need to call my daughter, please. She thinks I'm—" "We'll get you to a phone right away," the officer promised. "Both of you. Let's get you on the boat first, make sure you're stable, then we'll handle communications, okay?" Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The officer helped Victoria into the inflatable while his partner supported Daniel, both of them gentle with their rescued cargo. As they motored back to the cutter, Daniel looked back at the island that had been their prison and salvation for 10 days. The beach where they'd washed up, the jungle where he'd found fresh water, the rock outcropping that had sheltered them during the storm. It looked peaceful in the morning light, almost welcoming. But Daniel knew the truth. The island was indifferent to human survival. They'd lived not because the island had been kind, but because they'd refused to die. Because they'd had each other. Victoria's hand found his, squeezing gently. He squeezed back, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd survived together, everything they'd learned, everything that had changed between them in 10 impossible days. The Coast Guard medic was waiting on the cutter's deck, already preparing IV fluids and checking supplies. But the captain intercepted them first, a phone in his hand. "Mr. Reed," he said gently, "before we do medical eval, I thought you might want this." The satellite phone felt impossibly heavy in Daniel's hand. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number he knew by heart, the number he'd called every single day for the past 7 years. It rang once, twice. "Hello," Mrs. Chen's voice, thick with grief. "Mrs. Chen, it's Daniel. I'm alive. Can you put Emma on?" A sharp intake of breath, then shouting in the background, movement, and finally, "Daddy?" Emma's voice broke something in Daniel's chest. He sank to the deck, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak for a moment. "Daddy, is it really you?" "Yeah, baby," Daniel managed. "It's really me. I'm sorry I missed your recital. I'm so sorry." "I don't care about the recital." Emma was crying now, too. "They said you were dead. They said the plane crashed and everyone died." "I know, but I'm okay. I'm safe. And I'm coming home." Daniel looked up at Victoria, who was crying quietly while the medic checked her leg. "I made you a promise, remember? And Daddy always keeps his promises." "Always," Emma whispered. "Always," Daniel confirmed. "I love you, Em. So much. I love you too, Daddy. Come home soon. As fast as I can, I promise. When he finally hung up, Daniel sat there on the deck holding the phone, his whole body shaking with relief. Victoria lowered herself down beside him, wincing as her injured leg protested, and leaned her head against his shoulder. You kept your promise, she said softly. Not all of them. I missed the recital. But you're alive. And you're going home. That's what matters. Daniel knew she was right. Emma didn't care about ballet performances or perfect attendance. She cared that her father was alive and coming back to her. Everything else was just details. The Coast Guard cutter sliced through the Pacific swells with a steady rhythm that felt surreal after 10 days of island stillness. Daniel sat in the small medical bay while a young medic named Torres carefully cleaned and bandaged the various cuts and scrapes he'd accumulated during the crash and survival. His shoulder injury turned out to be a partially torn rotator cuff that would need physical therapy, but not surgery. Considering what could have happened, he'd gotten off easy. Through the open doorway, he could see Victoria in the adjacent examination area, her injured leg finally receiving proper medical attention. The ship's doctor was cleaning the wound with professional efficiency, explaining that while the infection had been serious, Daniel's improvised treatment had probably saved her life. Victoria caught his eye and offered a small smile, exhausted but genuinely grateful. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Reed, Torres said, applying antibiotic ointment to a particularly nasty cut on Daniel's forearm. 10 days on that island with minimal supplies, and you managed to keep yourself and Ms. Hale in relatively good shape. That's impressive. Didn't feel impressive at the time, Daniel admitted. Felt more like constant panic and improvisation. That's pretty much what survival is, Torres said with a knowing grin. My instructors used to say the people who survive aren't the ones with the most training. They're the ones who refuse to quit, even when quitting makes sense. Daniel thought about the moments when quitting had seemed not just sensible but inevitable. When Victoria's fever had spiked and the infection had spread. When the ship had sailed past without seeing their signal. When the storm had destroyed everything they'd built. Each time, giving up would have been easier than continuing to fight. But he'd had Emma to get back to. And somewhere along the way, he'd also had Victoria to keep alive. The Coast Guard's been in contact with Hale Industries, Torres continued, wrapping gauze around Daniel's arm. Your company's sending a private medical transport to meet us in Pago Pago. Should be there when we dock tomorrow morning. My company? Daniel looked confused. I work in facilities. I don't think they're sending private jets for me. Torres checked his tablet, scrolling through the information. Says here you're both employees of Hale Industries. The CEO herself authorized the transport. Oh, wait. He looked up, realization dawning. Ms. Hale is the CEO. Right. That makes more sense. Except it didn't. Not really. The old Victoria Hale would have arranged transport for herself and left Daniel to find his own way home. But something had changed on that island, and Daniel was starting to understand that the woman in the next room wasn't the same person who'd boarded Flight 447 11 days ago. Neither was he, for that matter. Captain Morrison appeared in the doorway, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Reed, we've got Pago Pago coordinating with San Francisco. Your daughter and her caretaker are being flown out on the same medical transport that's coming for you and Miss Hale. You'll be reunited before the flight back to the mainland. Daniel's throat tightened. Emma's coming here? Miss Hale insisted, Morrison said. Said something about you keeping a promise to your daughter, and she wasn't going to let bureaucracy delay that reunion one more day than necessary. He smiled. She's quite persuasive when she wants to be. That's one word for it, Daniel said, but he was smiling too. Through the doorway, he could see Victoria finishing up with the ship's doctor, and when she noticed him looking, she gave a small shrug as if to say it was nothing. Just a billionaire CEO, rearranging international travel logistics so a facilities manager could see his daughter 12 hours sooner. Just Victoria being Victoria. The new Victoria, anyway. That afternoon, as the cutter continued its steady progress toward American Samoa, Daniel found Victoria on the deck, watching the ocean roll past. She'd been given clean clothes from the ship's supply, cargo pants and a Coast Guard t-shirt that hung loose on her frame after 10 days of survival rations. Her hair was clean for the first time since the crash, pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the feverish pallor had been replaced by color returning to her cheeks. "Mind if I join you?" Daniel asked. "It's a small boat, kind of hard to avoid each other." But she was smiling as she said it, shifting to make room for him at the railing. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching seabirds wheel and dive over the waves. The island was long gone behind them, disappeared over the horizon hours ago. In a way, Daniel felt like he'd left part of himself back there. The part that had been content to be invisible, to go through the motions, to survive rather than live. "I talked to my board," Victoria said eventually. "Had Morrison patch me through on the satellite phone." "How'd that go?" "About as well as you'd expect when you call from the dead to tell them you're restructuring the entire company." Victoria's smile was sharp and satisfied. "They think I'm suffering from trauma-induced delusions. Tried to convince me to take a leave of absence, get psychiatric evaluation, not make any major decisions until I've recovered from my ordeal." "What did you tell them?" "That they could accept my new direction or accept my resignation, and either way the changes were happening." She turned to look at him directly. "I meant what I said on the island, Daniel. I'm done building empires at the expense of the people who make them possible. If the board doesn't like it, I'll find a new board." That's a pretty extreme reaction to 10 days on a beach. "Those 10 days taught me more about what matters than 34 years of chasing success ever did." Victoria's voice was firm, certain. "I built a billion-dollar company and almost died alone except for the one person I'd spent 3 years ignoring. That's not trauma talking, Daniel. That's clarity." Daniel understood that kind of clarity. He'd found it himself somewhere between the plane crash and this moment, a fundamental shift in how he saw his own life and choices. The realization that isolation wasn't protection, it was just another kind of prison. "What are you going to do when you get back?" Victoria asked. "Besides hug your daughter for approximately 12 hours straight." "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I've been thinking about that. The facilities job was safe, you know, steady paycheck, good benefits, familiar routine. But it was also limiting. I was capable of more but never pushed for it because pushing meant risk, and risk meant potential failure, and I couldn't afford to fail because Emma needed stability. And now? Now I'm wondering if the stability I gave her was actually just stagnation. If by playing it safe, I was teaching her to do the same." Daniel ran his hand through his still damp hair. "I want her to see me take chances, try new things, build a life instead of just maintaining one." Victoria nodded slowly, processing this. "Can I ask you something that might be completely inappropriate given that I'm technically still your employer?" "You can ask me anything. The island kind of demolished normal social boundaries." "Would you consider coming to work for me directly? Not facilities, I mean actually working with me on rebuilding the company culture." Victoria spoke quickly, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she slowed down. "I need someone who understands what it's like to be invisible in a corporate structure. Someone who can help me see the blind spots I've created. Someone I trust to tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Daniel stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You want me, a facilities manager with a partial college degree, to help you restructure a billion-dollar company?" "I want you, a man who kept both of us alive with nothing but determination and a pocket knife, to help me build something worth believing in." Victoria's eyes were serious, intent. "You saved my life, Daniel, multiple times, and more than that, you showed me what real leadership looks like. It's not about power or control, it's about showing up for people even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I don't know anything about corporate strategy or business development or—" "Neither did I when I started," Victoria interrupted. "I learned. You can learn too. And honestly, right now I don't need another MBA who thinks in quarterly earnings. I need someone who thinks in human terms, someone who understands that the people doing the actual work are just as valuable as the executives making the decisions." Daniel thought about Emma, about the promise he'd made to himself to stop playing it safe, about the conversation they'd had on the island about choosing differently, taking risks, letting people in. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "I need to talk to Emma, make sure she's okay with Dad taking on something new and potentially demanding." "Of course," Victoria said immediately. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready." She paused, then added more quietly, "I know I'm asking a lot. And I know I haven't earned the right to ask anything from you after the way I treated you for 3 years. But I'm asking anyway because I genuinely believe we could build something important together. You didn't treat me badly, Daniel said gently. You just didn't treat me at all. And honestly, that was mutual. I never tried to connect with you either. I was content to be invisible because visible meant vulnerable. We were both hiding, Victoria said. Yeah, but we're not hiding anymore. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Daniel of Emma's crayon drawings. Tomorrow he'd see her in person, hold her, promise her he'd never leave again, even though they both knew that was a promise he couldn't truly keep. Life was unpredictable. Planes crashed. Islands happened. The best you could do was show up and keep showing up and hope that was enough. Thank you, Victoria said suddenly. I know I said it before, but I need to say it again. Thank you for not leaving me to die on that beach. Thank you for the antibiotics and the fresh water and the terrible fish. Thank you for dancing your daughter's ballet routine in the rain to distract me from my fever dreams. Thank you for carrying me when I couldn't walk and for refusing to give up when I wanted to. You don't have to thank me, Daniel started, but Victoria shook her head. Yes, I do, because you didn't have to do any of that. You could have taken the survival kit and left me behind. Could have conserved resources instead of sharing them. Could have saved yourself instead of risking everything to keep both of us alive. She met his eyes. You're a good person, Daniel Reed, maybe the best person I've ever met. And I'm grateful the universe crashed us together, even if the circumstances were terrible. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'm grateful too. Which is a weird thing to say about a plane crash that almost killed us both, but it's true, Victoria finished. I know, I feel the same way. They stood together watching the sun disappear into the ocean, two survivors bound together by shared trauma and unexpected friendship. Tomorrow would bring reunions and medical evaluations and the complicated process of returning to a world that had already mourned them. But tonight, they had this moment of peace on a Coast Guard cutter somewhere in the Pacific, alive and healing and fundamentally changed. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The small bunk in the crew quarters was comfortable compared to the sand and seat cushions of the island, but his mind wouldn't settle. He kept thinking about Emma, about what he'd say when he saw her, how he'd explain where he'd been, what had happened, why he'd broken his promise about the recital. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and made his way to the deck. He wasn't surprised to find Victoria already there, wrapped in a blanket and staring at the stars. Couldn't sleep either? She asked as he approached. Too much quiet, Daniel said, settling beside her. Isn't that weird? 10 days on that island, I would have killed for a comfortable bed in silence, and now that I have it, I can't relax. The adrenaline's wearing off, Victoria said. We spent almost 2 weeks in constant survival mode, and our bodies are still calibrated for danger. Every creak of this ship sounds wrong because we're not hearing waves and jungle sounds. Is that the scientific explanation? That's the Victoria hasn't slept in 36 hours explanation, which may or may not be based in actual science. She pulled the blanket tighter. I keep having these flashes of the crash, the explosion, the water, thinking I was going to drown and there was nothing I could do about it. Daniel understood. He'd been having the same flashes, moments where his brain would suddenly throw him back to those terrifying seconds between the explosion and hitting the water. The absolute certainty of death. The primal fear, the desperate hope that somehow he'd survive for Emma's sake. Does it get better? Victoria asked quietly. The flashbacks? I don't know, Daniel admitted. I've never survived a plane crash before, but I've survived other hard things, and yeah, eventually the sharp edges dull. You stop reliving it every time you close your eyes. It becomes something that happened to you instead of something that's still happening. How long does that take? Depends on the person and whether they deal with it or try to ignore it. Daniel gave her a meaningful look. You should probably talk to someone when we get back. A therapist, I mean. Someone who specializes in trauma. Victoria made a face. I don't really do therapy. Yeah, well, you didn't really do vulnerability or honest communication either, and look how that worked out. Daniel softened his words with a smile. I'm just saying, we survived something major. It's okay to need help processing it. Do you have a therapist? I will by next week, Daniel said. Because Emma's going to need help dealing with the fact that her dad almost died, and I need to make sure I'm handling my own stuff so I can be there for her. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll find someone. But only because you're doing it too, and I refuse to be the one who's too stubborn to ask for help, while the facilities manager demonstrates emotional maturity. Former facilities manager? Daniel corrected. Pretty sure surviving a plane crash and 10 days on a deserted island earns me a title upgrade. Fine. Former facilities manager and current pain in my ass. But Victoria was smiling. Is this what friendship feels like? Annoying each other into making better life choices? Pretty much, Daniel confirmed. Welcome to having actual human connections. It's uncomfortable and messy and completely worth it. I'll take your word for it. Victoria shifted, wincing as her healing leg protested the movement. Can I tell you what I'm most afraid of? Always. I'm afraid that when we get back to civilization, I'll revert to who I was before. That the board will pressure me back into the old patterns, or the shareholders will revolt, or I'll just slip back into being CEO Victoria, because that's who I've been for so long. I don't know how to be anyone else. Daniel understood that fear intimately, the pull of familiar patterns, comfortable ruts, the path of least resistance. It would be easy to go back to his old life, his old job, his old habits of invisible survival. Then we'll hold each other accountable, he said. You make sure I don't retreat back into isolation, and I'll make sure you don't retreat back into empire building at the expense of your humanity. That's a lot of pressure to put on a friendship that's barely 2 weeks old. We survived 10 days on a deserted island together. I think we've earned the right to put pressure on our friendship. Daniel bumped her shoulder gently with his. Besides, you're stuck with me now. I saved your life, which means you're obligated to keep me around until the debt is repaid. I don't think that's how it works. Sure it is. It's an ancient maritime tradition. I read it somewhere. You're making that up. Completely, Daniel admitted. But it sounds good, doesn't it? Victoria laughed, and the sound carried across the dark water. Somewhere beneath them, the ocean teemed with life they couldn't see. Somewhere ahead, land was waiting with all its complications and demands. But here, now, they had this moment of peace and honesty and hard-won friendship. Thank you, Daniel, Victoria said again, for everything. Thank you for making me dance in the rain, Daniel replied, and for bringing Emma to Pago Pago, and for not giving up even when giving up seemed reasonable. We make a good team. Yeah, Daniel agreed. We really do. They stayed on deck until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, talking about everything and nothing. Victoria told him about her plans for the company, the specific changes she wanted to implement, the way she envisioned a business that valued people as much as profits. Daniel told her about Emma's latest obsession with marine biology, how she wanted to study dolphins when she grew up, how proud he was of her curiosity and kindness. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold, they'd sketched out the rough outline of a future that looked nothing like either of their pasts. It was uncertain and risky and probably foolish, but it was also hopeful in a way neither of them had felt in years. The Coast Guard cutter pulled into Pago Pago Harbor just after 8 in the morning. Daniel stood at the railing, his heart hammering as he scanned the dock for any sign of Emma. Captain Morrison had confirmed that the medical transport had arrived 2 hours earlier and that Emma and Mrs. Chen were waiting at the harbor master's office. I can see you vibrating from here, Victoria said, coming to stand beside him. She was dressed in clothes provided by the Coast Guard, cargo pants and a button-down shirt that almost fit, and looked more put together than she had any right to after their ordeal. You're going to launch yourself off this boat before we even dock. I haven't seen her in 11 days, Daniel said, his voice tight. 11 days she thought I was dead. Do you have any idea what that must have been like for her? No, Victoria admitted. But you're about to find out, and you're going to help her through it. That's what good parents do. The cutter maneuvered into its berth with practiced efficiency, crew members securing lines and preparing the gangway. The moment it was in place, Captain Morrison nodded to Daniel. Go ahead, Mr. Reed. Your daughter's waiting. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran down the gangway, his eyes scanning the small crowd that had gathered to witness the rescue ship's arrival. And then he saw her. Emma stood next to Mrs. Chen, wearing her favorite purple dress and holding a stuffed dolphin Daniel had won for her at a carnival 2 years ago. Her face was pale, tear-stained, and when she saw him, her expression went through a rapid progression of disbelief, hope, and overwhelming joy. "Daddy!" She launched herself at him, and Daniel caught her, lifting her up and holding her so tight he was probably hurting her, but he couldn't make himself let go. Emma buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of her relief. "I'm here, baby," Daniel murmured into her hair, his own tears flowing freely. "I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So, they said you were dead," Emma choked out between sobs. "They had a funeral and everything, and I had to wear black, and everyone kept saying you were in a better place. But I didn't want you in a better place. I wanted you here." I know, sweetheart." Daniel sank to his knees, still holding Emma, bringing them to eye level. "But I'm here now. I'm alive, and I'm okay, and I'm never going to leave you again." "You promised you wouldn't miss my recital," Emma said, and there was accusation in her voice mixed with the relief. "You promised, Daddy." "I did promise. And I broke that promise, and I'm so sorry." Daniel cupped her face gently, wiping away tears with his thumbs. "But do you know what I did on that island? When I was scared and hurting and didn't know if I'd ever get home?" Emma shook her head, sniffling. "I danced your ballet routine, the whole thing, every step you taught me. Because even though I wasn't there to see you perform, I was thinking about you every single second." Emma's eyes widened. "You danced? But you don't know how to dance." "I know. I was terrible. But I did it anyway because it made me feel close to you." Daniel managed a watery smile. "Your routine was beautiful, wasn't it?" "It was okay," Emma said. But she was smiling now too, just a little. "I messed up the spin part. You always nail that spin in practice. Not when I'm nervous, not when I'm looking for you in the audience and you're not there." Her voice got small again, fragile. "Everyone else's parents were there." The words cut deeper than any physical injury Daniel had sustained. This was the cost of survival, the price Emma had paid for his absence. Not just the fear of loss, but the very real pain of being the kid whose dad didn't show up. "I know," he said quietly, "and I can't change that. But I can promise you this. From now on, I'm going to be there. For every recital, every school event, every moment that matters. And even when I can't physically be there, you'll know I'm thinking about you. Always." "Promise?" Emma asked, and her voice held all the vulnerability of a 7-year-old who'd already been abandoned once by a parent and almost lost the other. "I promise," Daniel said, "and you know Daddy keeps his promises." "Always," Emma whispered, echoing the words they'd shared on the phone. "Always," Daniel confirmed, pulling her close again. They stayed like that for a long time, Daniel kneeling on the dock holding his daughter while Mrs. Chen stood nearby crying happy tears, and Victoria watched from the gangway with an expression that was equal parts wistful and deeply moved. Eventually, Emma pulled back enough to look at her father properly, her small hands patting his face and arms like she needed to confirm he was real. "You look different," she observed. "Skinnier. And you have a cut on your face." "I had an adventure," Daniel said. "Not a fun adventure like in books, but I'll tell you all about it when you're ready to hear it." "Was it scary?" "Very scary. The scariest thing that's ever happened to me." "Scarier than when Mom left?" The question hit Daniel in the chest. Emma rarely talked about her mother, had learned early that it was a painful subject best avoided. But apparently almost losing her father had broken through those careful barriers. "Different kind of scary," Daniel said honestly. "When your mom left, I was scared of being a bad dad and not knowing how to take care of you. On the island, I was scared I'd never get to be your dad again at all." Emma processed this, her face serious beyond her years. "I'm glad you weren't scared of that thing. I'm glad you came back." "Me too, baby. Me too." Mrs. Chen finally stepped forward, her own face wet with tears. "Mr. Reed, I'm so happy you're alive. We were all so worried." "Thank you for taking care of Emma," Daniel said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Thank you for being there when I couldn't be." "Of course, she's a wonderful child." Mrs. Chen smiled through her tears. But I'm very glad to return her to her father. Emma suddenly pulled back from Daniel, her attention caught by something behind him. Daddy, who's that lady on the boat? The one watching us? Daniel turned to see Victoria still standing on the gangway, keeping a respectful distance from their reunion, but clearly interested in the proceedings. When she realized she'd been spotted, she gave a small wave. That's Victoria, Daniel said. She was on the plane with me. We survived together. Is she your friend? The question was so simple, so straightforward in the way only children could be. Was Victoria his friend? After everything they'd been through, after the vulnerability and honesty and shared survival, was friend even an adequate word? Yeah, Daniel said, smiling. She's my friend. Can I meet her? Daniel looked back at Victoria, who was now making her way carefully down the gangway, favoring her injured leg but moving with determined purpose. When she reached them, she knelt down to Emma's level, despite the obvious pain it caused her. Hi, Emma, Victoria said gently. I've heard so much about you. Your dad talked about you every single day on that island. Emma studied Victoria with the intense scrutiny only 7-year-olds possessed, taking in everything from her borrowed clothes to the bandage on her leg to the genuine warmth in her eyes. Were you scared too? Emma asked. Terrified, Victoria admitted. The most scared I've ever been in my whole life. Did my daddy take care of you? He saved my life. Multiple times. Victoria glanced at Daniel with unmistakable gratitude. Your dad is the bravest, kindest person I've ever met. You're very lucky to have him. I know, Emma said with the absolute certainty of a child who'd almost lost something precious. He's the best daddy ever. Daniel felt his throat tighten again, overwhelmed by the love in his daughter's voice and the relief of being able to hear it in person instead of over a crackling satellite phone. Emma, he said gently, Victoria is the boss at my company. She's a very important person, and she made sure you could come here to see me instead of making us wait until we got back to San Francisco. Emma's eyes widened, clearly impressed. You're a boss? Like the president? Victoria laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Sort of like that, but for a company instead of a country. Are you rich? Emma! Daniel started to scold, but Victoria held up a hand. It's okay. Yes, I am rich, but your dad taught me that money doesn't help much when you're stranded on an island. What helps is having someone who won't give up on you. She smiled at Emma. He didn't give up on me, even when I was hurt and scared and wanted to quit. So I think you should be very proud of him. I am proud, Emma said. Then, with the fearlessness of childhood, she asked, Do you want to be friends with me too, not just my daddy? Victoria looked genuinely touched by the invitation. I would love that very much. Okay, Emma declared, apparently considering the matter settled. She grabbed Victoria's hand and Daniel's hand, connecting them together. Now you're both my friends and we're all together and nobody is dying on islands anymore. That's an excellent plan, Daniel said, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. No more islands. No more planes either, Emma added firmly. We're staying on the ground forever. We might need to take planes sometimes, Daniel said gently, but we'll be very careful. Can I come with you so I can make sure you're safe? The request was so earnest, so filled with the fear of separation after 11 days of believing she'd lost him, that Daniel had to fight back more tears. When I travel for work, you have school, he said, but we'll figure something out. Maybe video calls every night so you can see I'm okay, and I'll only travel when absolutely necessary. Deal? Deal, Emma agreed, though she didn't look entirely happy about it. The medical transport team arrived then, ready to conduct examinations and prepare for the flight back to San Francisco. There were doctors and nurses and coordinators, all bustling with professional efficiency. But through it all, Emma refused to let go of Daniel's hand, as if physical contact was the only thing keeping him tethered to this reality. During the medical evaluation, while Emma sat on his lap and described in great detail everything that had happened during his absence, Victoria underwent her own examination in the adjacent room. Through the open doorway, Daniel could hear the doctors discussing her recovery prospects, the need for follow-up surgery on her leg, the remarkable fact that she'd survived a serious infection with only improvised medical care. Your friend is very pretty, Emma whispered to Daniel while the doctor checked his blood pressure. Is she your girlfriend? No, sweetheart. Just friends. But she could be your girlfriend, Emma persisted. If you wanted, I wouldn't mind. Daniel smiled, touched by his daughter's attempt at matchmaking even in the midst of their reunion. It doesn't work that way, Em. Victoria and I are just friends. Good friends, but that's all. But you're lonely, Emma said with devastating 7-year-old directness. I know you are. You try to hide it, but I can tell. The observation stunned Daniel into silence. He'd thought he'd been so careful, so good at maintaining a cheerful facade for Emma's sake. Apparently, he'd been fooling no one but himself. I'm not lonely when I'm with you, he said finally, but when I'm at school you are, or when I'm sleeping, or when you think I'm not looking and you get that sad face. Emma touched his cheek gently. I want you to be happy, Daddy, really happy, not just pretend happy. Daniel pulled her close, overwhelmed by the depth of her perception and care. When had his little girl become so wise? When had she started worrying about his happiness instead of just her own? I promise I'll try, he said, to be really happy, not just pretend, okay? Okay, Emma agreed, then lowering her voice conspiratorially, but I still think Victoria is nice, just in case you change your mind about the girlfriend thing. The press conference was held at Hale Industries headquarters in a conference room that could hold about 100 people, but had been packed with closer to 200 reporters, cameras, and curiosity seekers who'd somehow obtained credentials. Daniel stood backstage with Victoria, both of them dressed in professional clothes that felt strange after days of Coast Guard cargo pants and island improvisation. You ready? Victoria asked, adjusting her blazer for the third time. Despite her confident words on the phone, she looked as nervous as Daniel felt. No, Daniel admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. That's the spirit. Victoria took a deep breath, steadied herself on her healing leg, and walked out onto the small stage. The room erupted with shouted questions, flashing cameras, a wall of noise that hit like a physical force. Victoria waited patiently at the podium until the chaos settled into something approaching order. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice calm and professional. As you know, Daniel Reed and I are survivors of Flight 447, which crashed in the Pacific Ocean 11 days ago. We spent 10 days stranded on a remote island before being rescued by the U.S. Coast Guard, to whom we owe an incredible debt of gratitude. More shouted questions, but Victoria pressed on. We're both recovering well from our injuries and are grateful to be home with our loved ones. The crash was a tragedy that claimed many lives, and our thoughts are with the families of those who didn't survive. She paused, and Daniel could see genuine emotion in her eyes. We were incredibly lucky. We know that. And we don't take a single moment of our survival for granted. She gestured for Daniel to join her at the podium. He walked out on legs that felt like water, very aware of every camera trained on him, every face watching, every person waiting to hear the dramatic survival story. Daniel Reed is a valued member of the Hale Industries team, Victoria continued, and Daniel noticed she didn't specify his former position in facilities. His quick thinking, resourcefulness, and refusal to give up kept us both alive during those 10 days. I owe him my life, and I'll spend the rest of my career making sure the people who work as hard as Daniel are actually recognized and valued for their contributions. The reporters erupted with questions. Who rescued you? What did you eat? Were you injured? How did you survive? What was the worst moment? Were you scared? Will you fly again? Are you suing the airline? Victoria fielded them with practiced skill, giving enough detail to satisfy curiosity without revealing the deeply personal moments that belonged only to them. Daniel added occasional confirmations, keeping his responses brief and focusing on gratitude for the rescue rather than dramatic narrative. Then someone asked the question Daniel had been dreading. Mr. Reed, you're a single father, correct? What was it like being separated from your daughter, not knowing if you'd see her again? The room fell silent, waiting for his answer. Daniel could see Victoria looking at him with concern, ready to deflect if needed. But Emma deserved better than deflection. She deserved the truth. It was the worst part of everything, Daniel said quietly. Worse than the crash, worse than the injuries, worse than not knowing if rescue would come. I'd promised my daughter I'd be home for her ballet recital, and I broke that promise. She spent those days thinking I was dead, and there was nothing I could do to tell her I was okay. His voice caught. Being separated from Emma was harder than anything else I've ever experienced. How is she handling your return? She's 7 years old and she's resilient and she's the bravest person I know, Daniel said. We're going to get through this together, as a family. The reporter pressed on. And Ms. Hill, what about your family? How are they handling— I don't have family, Victoria said bluntly. No children, no spouse, no siblings or parents. It was just me, which made the island both easier and harder. Easier because I didn't have loved ones worrying. Harder because I didn't have loved ones worth surviving for. She glanced at Daniel. Until Daniel reminded me that even without traditional family, life is still worth fighting for. The moment was getting too personal, too raw. Victoria's PR director stepped in smoothly, thanking everyone for coming and announcing that both survivors needed rest and wouldn't be taking further questions. Security ushered reporters out while Daniel and Victoria escaped through a side door. In the quiet of Victoria's office, with the door firmly closed against the chaos, they both collapsed into chairs and exhaled. Well, Victoria said, that was terrible. Absolutely awful, Daniel agreed, but necessary. Unfortunately. They sat in silence for a moment, processing the performance they'd just given. Through the window, Daniel could see the San Francisco skyline stretching out in all directions, millions of lives being lived in buildings and streets and hidden corners. All those people going about their ordinary days, unaware of how precious and fragile their ordinary lives were. I meant what I said, Victoria broke the silence. About making sure people like you are valued. I'm starting immediately. Victoria, you don't have to— Yes, I do. She turned to face him directly. The board is having an emergency meeting tomorrow to discuss my concerning behavior and possible trauma-induced instability. Apparently, wanting to treat employees like human beings is a sign of mental breakdown. Daniel felt anger flash through him. They can't do that. You're the CEO. They can recommend I step down for health reasons, can pressure shareholders to vote me out, can make my life extremely difficult if they choose to. Victoria's smile was sharp. But I'm not backing down. I built this company, and I'm not letting them destroy what I'm trying to create now. What do you need from me? Come to the meeting, as my partner. Let them see that this isn't trauma talking. It's a genuine strategic shift based on real experience and practical observation. Victoria leaned forward. I need them to see us together, to understand that this isn't a breakdown. It's a breakthrough. Daniel thought about his apartment, his daughter, the safe, ordinary life he'd been rebuilding. Walking into a boardroom fight meant risking all of that, meant putting himself in a position where powerful people might see him as a threat. But it also meant keeping his promise to Victoria, to himself, to Emma, who told him to stop pretending and start actually living. What time's the meeting? He asked. Victoria's smile was brilliant with relief and gratitude. 9 a.m. I'll send a car. I'll take the bus, Daniel corrected. I'm not showing up in a company car like I've already been bought. I'm coming as your partner, which means arriving on my own terms. Fair enough. Victoria stood carefully, favoring her injured leg. Thank you, Daniel, for all of it. We're in this together, Daniel reminded her. That's what partners do. That evening, Daniel sat Emma down for a serious conversation about what might be coming. She listened with wide eyes as he explained that he was going to start a new job working with Victoria, that it might mean some changes to their routine, that some people might not like what they were trying to do. Are you going to get in trouble? Emma asked, worried. Maybe, Daniel admitted. Some people don't like change, and Victoria and I are trying to change some big things. But it's good change, right? Like when I changed my mind about vegetables and decided broccoli was actually okay. Daniel smiled at the comparison. Yeah, kind of like that. We're trying to help the company decide that treating people well is actually a good thing. Emma considered this seriously. I think you should do it, even if some people get mad. Because sometimes people get mad when you do the right thing, but you still have to do it anyway. When did you get so wise? Daniel asked, echoing his question from the night before. I told you, I've always been wise. You're just finally listening. Emma crawled into his lap, something she only did when she was feeling particularly affectionate or worried. Daddy, are you going to keep being friends with Victoria? Yeah, sweetheart, I am. Good. Because she needs friends too. She told me she doesn't have family, and that's really sad. Everyone should have family. She has her company, her employees. That's not the same, Emma interrupted with 7-year-old certainty. Family is people who love you even when you mess up, people who help you when you're scared, people who remember you like broccoli now, even though you used to hate it. Daniel pulled his daughter closer, overwhelmed by her capacity for empathy and insight. You're absolutely right. That is what family is. So maybe we could be Victoria's family, Emma suggested. Like how Mrs. Chen is kind of family, even though she's not related to us. We could be family for Victoria, too. The suggestion was so simple, so pure, that Daniel felt his throat tighten. I think Victoria would really like that. Then it's settled, Emma declared, hopping off his lap with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who'd just solved a major problem. We're Victoria's family now. I'll make her a welcome to the family card tomorrow. She skipped off to her room to start on the card immediately, leaving Daniel sitting alone with the weight of his daughter's casual declaration. Somewhere in the city, Victoria was probably preparing for tomorrow's board meeting, steeling herself for a fight that would determine the future of her company and the new direction she was trying to build. And apparently she now had family waiting to support her. Daniel picked up his phone and sent a quick text. Emma has decided we're your family now. She's making you a welcome card as we speak. Hope that's okay. The response came quickly. I can't think of anything I'd like more. Daniel arrived at Hale Industries headquarters at 8:45, giving himself 15 minutes to prepare before the board meeting that would either validate their vision or destroy it completely. He'd taken the bus as promised, riding through morning traffic with commuters who had no idea they were sitting next to someone about to walk into a corporate battlefield. The lobby was exactly as he remembered from 3 years of working here. Soaring ceilings, marble floors, the kind of intimidating grandeur designed to remind visitors that Hale Industries was powerful and important. Daniel had walked through this lobby hundreds of times as the invisible facilities guy, and nobody had ever looked at him twice. Today, the receptionist's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Reed," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "It's so good to see you. We were all so worried when we heard about the crash." Daniel blinked, surprised. "You know who I am?" "Of course. You fixed the air conditioning in our break room last summer when it was 100 degrees outside. Saved all our lives." She smiled. "I'm Melissa, by the way. We've never actually been introduced." "Nice to meet you, Melissa." Daniel shook her offered hand, still processing this interaction. In 3 years, the receptionist had never spoken to him beyond basic greetings, and he'd assumed she simply didn't notice him. Apparently, he'd been wrong. "Ms. Hale is expecting you," Melissa continued. 23rd floor executive boardroom. "And Mr. Reed, good luck in there. A lot of us are hoping you and Mrs. Hale succeed with whatever you're planning." Daniel rode the elevator up, watching the floor numbers climb and trying to calm his racing heart. He'd faced down wild pigs and storms and the very real possibility of death. A room full of executives in expensive suits should have been nothing by comparison. Except those executives had the power to destroy everything Victoria was trying to build. And unlike the island, this battle would be fought with words and politics and corporate maneuvering instead of survival skills. Victoria was waiting outside the boardroom, pacing despite her injured leg. She'd dressed for war in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, her hair pulled back severely, every inch the powerful CEO. But when she saw Daniel, relief flooded her face. "You came," she said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I was about 60% sure." Victoria managed a small smile. "The other 40% thought you'd come to your senses and decide this was insane." "It is insane," Daniel agreed, "but we're doing it anyway." They stood together outside the boardroom doors, and Daniel could hear voices inside, board members arriving, taking their seats, preparing to dismantle Victoria's vision. He thought about Emma's welcome to the family card sitting in his jacket pocket, colorful dolphins drawn in crayon with the words, "We're glad you're part of our family now," in Emma's careful second-grade handwriting. "I have something for you," Daniel said, pulling out the card. From Emma. Victoria opened it, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She traced the dolphins with one finger, reading Emma's message over and over. She made this for me? Victoria's voice was thick with emotion. She decided we're your family now. Apparently it wasn't up for debate. Daniel smiled. So whatever happens in there, remember you're not alone. You have family waiting for you. Victoria carefully folded the card and tucked it into her own jacket pocket, right over her heart. Okay, she said, squaring her shoulders. Let's go build something worth believing in. They walked into the boardroom together. The executive conference table was massive, designed to seat 20 people comfortably, with room for additional chairs along the walls. 12 board members were already seated, ranging from elderly investors who'd backed Victoria's startup 20 years ago to younger tech executives who'd joined more recently. All of them looked up when Daniel and Victoria entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria, one of the older men said, standing with the kind of formal courtesy that somehow felt like an insult. We're glad you're safe. And Mr. Reed, welcome. Though I must say we weren't expecting you to bring... He paused, clearly not sure what to call Daniel. Guests to this meeting. Daniel Reed is my partner, Victoria said firmly, taking her seat at the head of the table and gesturing for Daniel to take the chair beside her. Anything discussed in this meeting concerns him directly. Your partner in what capacity? A woman asked sharply. Margaret Chen, if Daniel remembered correctly. No relation to Mrs. Chen, but equally formidable in her own way. She ran a venture capital firm and had a reputation for crushing startups that didn't meet her expectations. In rebuilding this company's culture and operational philosophy, Victoria said, Daniel will be working directly with me on implementing human-centered policies and ensuring employee welfare becomes a priority alongside profit margins. The room erupted in overlapping objections. You can't be serious. This is exactly what we were worried about. Victoria, you're clearly not thinking straight. We need to discuss a temporary leave of absence. Victoria waited for the noise to die down, her expression calm and unmoved. When silence finally returned, she spoke with the same steel Daniel had heard her use on the island when she'd pushed him to enter the jungle despite his fear. I am completely serious. I am thinking more clearly than I have in years, and I'm not taking a leave of absence. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. I built this company from nothing. I know every line of code in our original software, every contract that got us to where we are today, every decision that built a billion-dollar enterprise. And I'm telling you now that we've been doing it wrong. Our profit margins are among the highest in the industry, one of the younger executives protested. Our stock price has grown consistently. We're successful by every measurable metric. Except the ones that actually matter, Daniel said, surprising himself by speaking. All eyes turned to him, and he felt his throat go dry, but he pushed forward anyway. Except employee satisfaction, retention rates among mid-level staff, the percentage of workers who feel valued and seen by management. By those metrics, you're failing. And you would know this how? Margaret Chen asked coldly. You're a facilities manager. I was a facilities manager, Daniel corrected, which means I spent 3 years being completely invisible to every executive in this company. I fixed your air conditioning and replaced your light bulbs and made sure your offices were comfortable, and not one of you ever looked at me long enough to remember my face. He let that sink in. There are hundreds of employees like me at Hale Industries, people who do essential work and get treated like they don't exist. That's not a sustainable business model. It's just cruelty disguised as efficiency. The room was silent. Several board members had the grace to look uncomfortable. The crash changed my perspective, Victoria said into that silence. When that plane was going down, I realized that everything I'd built, all the success, all the power, all the profit margins, meant absolutely nothing. I was going to die alone, unmourned by anyone except maybe some employees who'd be more relieved than sad that the Ice Queen CEO was gone. She paused. But Daniel saved my life multiple times, and he did it not because I was his boss or because of my net worth or corporate position. He did it because he saw me as a human being worth saving. That's the culture I want to build here. One where people actually see each other, where employees aren't just resources to be managed, but humans to be valued. That's very touching, Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension. But it's not a business strategy. You're letting trauma cloud your judgment. Is it trauma to want people to be treated with dignity? Victoria shot back. Is it poor judgment to believe that happy, valued employees are more productive than miserable, invisible ones? Is it instability to suggest that we measure success by more than just quarterly earnings? It's idealistic nonsense, another board member said bluntly. The market doesn't care about your feelings, Victoria. Shareholders care about returns. Competitors care about beating us. You can't run a company on good intentions and therapy speak. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, sharp and hot. These people had no idea what Victoria had survived, what she'd been through, how hard she was fighting to become someone better than who she'd been. You want to talk about business strategy? Daniel said, his voice harder than he'd intended. Fine. Let's talk numbers. Employee turnover costs companies an average of 33% of a worker's annual salary to replace them. At Hale Industries, you have a 28% annual turnover rate among non-executive staff. That's millions of dollars spent every year recruiting, hiring, and training replacements for people who leave because they don't feel valued. He pulled out his phone, displaying the research he'd done last night instead of sleeping. Companies with high employee satisfaction scores outperform the stock market by 247%. Businesses that invest in workplace culture see 33% increase in revenue growth. These aren't feelings, they're facts. Treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's financially smart. The board members were listening now, actually listening. Margaret Chen leaned forward, her expression still skeptical but interested. "Where did you get these numbers?" she asked. Harvard Business Review, Gallup Workplace Studies, Society for Human Resource Management Research, Daniel listed. I can send you the citations if you want to verify them. But the point is, Victoria isn't proposing we abandon profit for some utopian fantasy. She's proposing we build a sustainable business model that values the people who make profit possible in the first place. Victoria picked up the thread seamlessly. I'm proposing specific, measurable changes. Flexible work arrangements for parents and caregivers. Transparent salary structures to eliminate pay inequity. Mental health resources and counseling. Recognition programs that actually acknowledge employee contributions. Investment in training and development for non-executive staff. She pulled out her own tablet, displaying detailed proposals she'd apparently been working on. I've run projections. Initial implementation will cost approximately $4 million. Within 2 years, we'll recoup that through reduced turnover, increased productivity, and improved company reputation that will help us attract top talent. And if the projections are wrong, one of the older board members asked, if this experiment fails? Then I'll take full responsibility, Victoria said, but I'm not asking permission to try. I'm informing you that this is the direction the company is taking. If the board disagrees so strongly that you want to remove me, then vote. But understand that if you do, you're not just removing a CEO who's had a change of heart. You're removing the person who built this company from nothing and knows it better than anyone else in this room. The challenge hung in the air. Margaret Chen looked around the table, clearly calculating votes and alliances. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to make the first move. I have a counter-proposal, Margaret said finally. A pilot program. Implement these changes in one division, say, the operations department where Mr. Reed has experience. 6 months to show measurable improvement in both employee satisfaction and productivity metrics. If it works, we expand company-wide. If it fails, we revisit this conversation with data instead of idealism. Victoria looked at Daniel, a silent question in her eyes. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to prove that treating people well could coexist with business success. I can work with that, Daniel said. Then we have an agreement, Victoria said, turning back to Margaret. 6 months. Operations department. Full autonomy to implement changes without board interference. Within the $4 million budget you mentioned, Margaret countered. Agreed. They shook on it across the massive conference table, and just like that, the battle was won. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to start building something new. The board meeting continued for another hour, discussing logistics and timelines and metrics for success. Daniel contributed where he could, mostly listening and learning the language of corporate strategy that was so different from the survival strategies he'd learned on the island. When it finally ended, Victoria walked out with her head high and her vision intact. Daniel followed, still processing what had just happened. They'd walked into that boardroom expecting a fight to the death, and had emerged with a compromise that gave them exactly what they needed, a chance to prove their vision could work. In the elevator riding down, Victoria finally let her professional mask slip. She leaned against the wall, exhaling a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. "We did it," she said. "You did it," Daniel corrected. "That was all you in there. You backed me up with research and passion and facts they couldn't argue with." Victoria smiled. "We did it together, like everything else." The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and Melissa, the receptionist, gave them both enthusiastic thumbs up. Apparently, word had already spread about the board meeting's outcome. "Mr. Reed," Victoria said as they walked toward the exit, "I know you said you'd take the bus home, but would you consider letting me drive you? I'd like to talk about next steps, and I think better in cars than in boardrooms." Daniel agreed, and soon they were in Victoria's sleek electric sedan. Apparently, she drove herself sometimes instead of always using drivers, heading through San Francisco traffic toward Daniel's apartment. "I want to offer you a formal position," Victoria said as she navigated the streets with surprising competence for someone who probably had a driver 90% of the time. "Director of Employee Experience and Cultural Development. Salary commensurate with executive level, full benefits, equity stake in the company. You'd report directly to me and have authority over implementing the changes we discussed." Daniel's head spun. "Victoria, that's an executive position. I don't have the qualifications." "You have exactly the qualifications needed," Victoria interrupted. "You understand what it's like to be unseen. You know how to solve problems with limited resources. You care about people and you're not afraid to fight for what's right, even when it's hard." She glanced at him briefly before returning her eyes to the road. "Those are the qualifications that matter. The rest you can learn." "What about Emma? I can't work 80-hour weeks or travel constantly or—" "Then don't," Victoria said simply. "Part of building a better culture means modeling work-life balance ourselves. You want to leave at 3 to pick Emma up from school? Do it. You need to work from home when she's sick? Do it. You want to bring her to the office sometimes? We'll create a space where that's not just allowed, but welcomed." She paused. "I meant what I said about not making people choose between career and family. That starts with us." Daniel thought about Emma's words from the night before, about how he should take chances even if people got mad, about doing the right thing even when it was hard. He thought about his promise to stop pretending and start actually living. "Okay," he said. "Yes, I'll do it." Victoria's smile was brilliant. "Thank you. I can't do this without you." "Sure you can. You're Victoria Hale. You built a billion-dollar company from nothing." "I built an empire," Victoria corrected. "Now I'm trying to build something that actually matters. And for that, I need a partner who remembers what it's like to be human." She pulled up in front of Daniel's apartment building, putting the car in park but not moving to leave. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the engine humming quietly. "Can I ask you something personal?" Victoria said finally. "Always." "When we were on the island, you said you'd been lonely for years, that you'd isolated yourself to protect Emma from potential hurt." She turned to face him. "Are you still lonely?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "Less than I was. The island forced me to let someone in, and it turns out that was exactly what I needed. Still getting used to having an actual friend instead of just being Emma's dad and nothing else." "Just friends?" Victoria's voice was careful, neutral. "What else would we be?" "I don't know," Victoria admitted. Emma keeps suggesting I could be your girlfriend, and Mrs. Chen makes pointed comments about how we look at each other, and I'm starting to wonder if everyone else sees something we're both too scared to acknowledge." Daniel's heart started pounding. They were treading into territory he'd been carefully avoiding, questions he'd been refusing to ask himself. Yes, he cared about Victoria. Yes, she'd become important to him in ways that went beyond simple friendship. But caring about someone meant vulnerability, risk, the possibility of loss and pain. "I'm terrified," he said honestly. "Emma's already lost one parent. If I started something with you and it didn't work out, it would hurt her. I can't do that to her." "What if it did work out?" Victoria asked quietly. "What if taking the risk meant Emma got to see what healthy relationships look like? What if playing it safe means teaching her to be as lonely and isolated as we've both been? That's a lot of what ifs. Life is what ifs, Victoria said. What if the plane hadn't crashed? What if the rescue hadn't come? What if we'd given up on that island instead of fighting? She reached across the console to take his hand. We survived impossible odds together, Daniel. Maybe we should stop being so scared of the possible ones. Daniel looked at their joined hands, thinking about everything they'd been through. The crash, and the island, and the survival, and the rebuilding. The vulnerability and honesty and gradual transformation from strangers to friends to something that didn't quite have a name yet. I need to talk to Emma first, he said. Make sure she's actually okay with this and not just matchmaking because she thinks I need a girlfriend. Of course, Victoria agreed immediately. This affects her too. She gets a vote. And we go slow, Daniel continued. I haven't dated in 7 years. I have no idea what I'm doing. I haven't dated in longer than that. We'll figure it out together. Victoria squeezed his hand gently, like everything else. Daniel smiled, feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless for years. Okay, let me talk to Emma. Then we'll see where this goes. That's all I'm asking. Victoria drove away a few minutes later, leaving Daniel standing on the sidewalk processing what had just happened. In the span of 2 hours, he'd fought a corporate battle, accepted an executive position, and possibly started something that looked a lot like the beginning of a relationship. The island had taught him to stop surviving and start living. Apparently, he was taking that lesson seriously. Emma was waiting when he got upstairs, bouncing with barely contained energy. How did it go? She demanded. Did you win? Is Victoria still your boss? Are you still partners? We won, Daniel confirmed. Victoria is still my boss, I'm still her partner, and I have a new job with a fancy title that I'll explain when you're older. Is Victoria still part of our family? Definitely still part of our family. Emma studied his face with that unnerving perceptiveness she'd developed. Something else happened. You look different. What kind of different? Happy different. Real happy, not pretend happy. Emma grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the couch. Tell me everything. So Daniel told her, in age-appropriate terms, about the board meeting and the new job and the fact that maybe, possibly, if Emma was okay with it, he and Victoria might start spending time together in ways that were more than just friends. Emma listened with serious concentration, processing each piece of information carefully. When Daniel finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Are you scared? She asked finally. Terrified, Daniel admitted. Because of Mom? Because she left and you think Victoria might leave too? The question hit hard. Yeah, partly. And because you've had enough loss in your life, I don't want to bring someone into our family who might hurt you. But Daddy, Victoria already is in our family, Emma said with simple logic. And she already could hurt us if she wanted to, so either we trust her or we don't. And I trust her. Just like that? Just like that. Emma smiled. She survived the island with you. She made sure I could see you fast when you got rescued. She listened to all my dolphin stories and didn't get bored. And she makes you do the real smile. She shrugged. That's enough for me. Daniel pulled his daughter close, overwhelmed by her capacity for trust and forgiveness. When did you get so wise? I keep telling you, I've always been wise. Emma hugged him back fiercely. So can we invite Victoria for dinner? I want to tell her she can be your girlfriend now. Emma, it doesn't work like that. We have to actually go on dates first, get to know each other better. You survived on an island together for 10 days. How much better do you need to know each other? Fair point. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the operations department of Hale Industries watching the morning shift change. Employees filtered in with coffee and conversation, greeting each other by name, stopping to check the new wellness board where mental health resources and upcoming events were posted. The atmosphere was completely different from what it had been just a few months ago. Lighter, friendlier, genuinely warm. The numbers came in, Victoria said, appearing beside him with her tablet. Her leg had healed completely, though she still favored it slightly when she was tired. Employee satisfaction in operations is up 42%. Turnover is down to 8%. Productivity is up 19%. And we're under budget by $600,000. That should shut Margaret Chen up, Daniel said. Margaret Chen called me yesterday to ask if we could accelerate the company-wide rollout, Victoria said with satisfaction. Apparently, several board members have family who work in operations and have been hearing rave reviews about the new policies. Daniel smiled. They'd spent 3 months proving that treating people well wasn't just morally right, but financially smart. The pilot program had exceeded every metric, and now the board was asking them to expand instead of fighting against it. "We did it," he said. "We did," Victoria agreed, "and we're just getting started." They'd fallen into an easy partnership over the past 3 months, both professionally and personally. The dating had been awkward at first, two people who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable in different ways learning to trust again. But slowly, carefully, they'd built something real. Dinners with Emma, where they all laughed together. Weekend trips to the aquarium because Emma was still obsessed with dolphins. Quiet evenings after Emma was asleep, where they talked about everything and nothing. Victoria had become a regular presence in their lives, and Emma had adopted her as honorary family with the same fierce loyalty she showed Daniel. Last week, Emma's school had an event for Bring an Important Person to Class Day, and she'd invited Victoria alongside Daniel because, "Daddy, you're both important to me." Watching Victoria sit in a too-small chair listening to 7-year-olds discuss their favorite animals had been one of the best moments of Daniel's life. "Emma wants to know if you're coming to her dance showcase next month," Daniel said. "She's been practicing a new routine specifically to show you." "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Victoria said immediately. "I've already blocked out the whole evening." "She also wants to know when you're going to move in with us because apparently you're at our apartment all the time anyway, and it's silly to keep two places." Victoria laughed. "She said that?" "Almost verbatim. Then she suggested we could use your penthouse for sleepovers because she's never stayed in a penthouse before." "That child is going to rule the world someday." "Probably," Daniel agreed proudly. His phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Chen, who was picking Emma up from school today. A photo appeared, Emma grinning at the camera, holding up a paper with a big gold star and "excellent work" written across the top. Daniel showed Victoria, and they both smiled at Emma's obvious pride. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Victoria said softly. "When the plane was crashing, I was terrified because I thought I was dying alone, that I'd built this whole life and nobody would actually mourn me." She looked at Daniel. "But now if something happened to me, I'd be mourned, really mourned. By you, by Emma, by employees who actually know my name and see me as human. That's what we built these past 3 months. Not just better policies or higher satisfaction scores, actual human connection. That's what happens when you let people in," Daniel said. "It's terrifying and messy and complicated, but it's also worth it. Very worth it." They stood together watching the operations floor come to life. Two people who'd survived the impossible and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. The island had stripped away everything that didn't matter and shown them what did: human connection, honest vulnerability, the courage to choose differently. That evening, Daniel and Victoria picked up Emma from Mrs. Chen's apartment together. Emma ran to hug them both, talking a mile a minute about her gold star and the science project she was working on, and could they please get ice cream to celebrate. "Ice cream sounds perfect," Victoria said, and Emma cheered. They walked through the San Francisco streets as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emma held both their hands, swinging between them like she'd done this her whole life. Strangers smiled at them as they passed, a family out for evening ice cream, ordinary and unremarkable and absolutely precious. "I'm happy," Emma announced as they waited in line at her favorite ice cream shop. "Are you guys happy too?" Daniel looked at Victoria, saw the same wonder in her eyes that he felt in his chest. 3 months ago, they'd been strangers bound together by survival. Now they were family, chosen and built and maintained through daily decisions to keep showing up for each other. "Yeah, Em," Daniel said. "I'm really happy." "Me too," Victoria added. "Happier than I've ever been." "Good," Emma declared with satisfaction. "Because you're both part of my family now, and families should be happy together." They got ice cream, chocolate chip for Emma, vanilla for Daniel, salted caramel for Victoria, and found a bench in the nearby park. Emma chattered about her day while ice cream dripped down her cone, completely unconcerned with the mess. Victoria helped her clean up without complaint, and Daniel felt his heart expand watching them together. Daddy, Emma said suddenly, if you and Victoria get married someday, can we have the wedding on a beach? Not the scary island beach, but a nice beach where nobody crashes? Daniel choked on his ice cream while Victoria tried very hard not to laugh. We haven't even, that's not something you need to worry about right now, Daniel stammered. I'm not worried, Emma said cheerfully. I'm planning. There's a difference. And I think a beach wedding would be really pretty, with dolphins if we can find them. I'll keep that in mind, Victoria said, her eyes dancing with amusement. Dolphins and all. They finished their ice cream as the streetlights came on, the city settling into its evening rhythm around them. Eventually, they headed home, all three of them going to Daniel's apartment because that's where family gathered, where the photos and the dolphin collection and Emma's welcome to the family card lived. Later that night, after Emma was asleep and Victoria was getting ready to head to her own place, she paused at the door. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For pulling me out of the water, for refusing to let me give up on that island, for seeing me when I'd spent years making myself invisible. Victoria smiled. For giving me a family when I thought I'd be alone forever. Daniel stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Thank you for making me dance in the rain, for pushing me to stop surviving and start living, for showing Emma what it looks like when someone chooses to change and grow. We saved each other, Victoria said. Yeah, Daniel agreed. We really did. They kissed goodnight, sweet and simple and full of promise. Then Victoria left for her penthouse, and Daniel went to check on Emma one more time before bed. His daughter was sprawled across her mattress in that boneless way only children could achieve, her dolphin collection arranged around her like guardians. Daniel smoothed her hair gently, marveling at the person she was becoming, wise and kind and brave enough to welcome new family members without fear. I kept my promise, Daniel whispered to his sleeping daughter. I came home, and I'm going to keep showing up every day for the rest of your life. Emma stirred slightly, murmuring something about dolphins and weddings, then settled back into deep sleep. Daniel stood in the doorway of his daughter's room in his modest apartment in the Sunset District and felt wealthier than he'd ever felt in his life. Not because of the new executive salary or equity stake or corporate title, but because he had a daughter who loved him, a partner who challenged him to be better, and a life built on authentic connection instead of isolation. The plane crash had nearly killed him. The island had stripped him bare. The survival had transformed him. And now, finally, he was actually living. Not just surviving, not just pretending, but genuinely, messily, beautifully living. Outside, San Francisco breathed and moved and continued its endless rhythm. Somewhere in the city, Victoria was probably still awake, planning their next steps for the company expansion. Somewhere, employees were going home to families that mattered more than quarterly earnings. Somewhere, people were making the choice to see each other, to value each other, to build something better than what came before. And here, in a small apartment that had witnessed both tragedy and joy, Daniel Reed stood watch over his sleeping daughter and felt profoundly grateful for every impossible moment that had brought him to this place. The island had taught him that titles meant nothing when survival was at stake, that corporate hierarchies dissolved in the face of shared humanity, that the invisible people were often the ones who saved your life. He'd taken those lessons and built something new. Not perfect, they were all still learning, still stumbling, still figuring out how to balance idealism with reality. But they were building something real, something human, something worth the fight. Emma would grow up seeing her father take chances instead of playing it safe, would learn that changing course wasn't weakness but courage, would understand that family could be chosen as well as born, and somewhere far away, the island still existed in the Pacific, indifferent to the humans who'd washed up on its shore and emerged transformed. The beach where they'd fought for survival, the jungle where Daniel had found fresh water, the rock outcropping that had sheltered them during the storm. Those places were just geography now, coordinates on a map. But the lessons they'd learned there about resilience and vulnerability and the courage to keep fighting even when fighting seemed pointless, those lessons had come home with them, and they'd changed everything. Daniel turned off Emma's light, closed her door gently, and went to his own room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings and employee initiatives, and the daily work of building a better company culture. But tonight, he could rest knowing that he'd kept his promises. To Emma, to Victoria, to himself. The promise to show up, the promise to keep fighting, the promise to choose life over mere survival, always.